Everybody, thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 10th, 2026, about 10 a.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 18 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, a textbook written by the mysterious Professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. Today we are jumping into part 4 of this book and starting chapter 8. Part 4's title is Founding Psychology, starting on page 217. And chapter 8 is titled The Psychology of Consciousness. And we will try to finish all of this momentous chapter. It's not impossible. We have enough time. I got some work to do later, but we will tackle all of this and try to finish up this book over the weekend. Let's see if we can do that. Hey, even if you fail, we keep on trying and trying again. I got the comment section open here. If anybody has any comments, suggestions, anything they want to say it with your chest over here in the comment section. I will try to read it, and I will be reacting to everything that comes. Without further ado, let's get into it. So chapter 8, The Psychology of Consciousness. By the last quarter of the 19th century, conditions were ripe for psychology to emerge as an autonomous science. As we have seen, scientific psychology was fated to be born as the hybrid offspring of physiology and philosophy of mind, called psychology by the middle of the century. Wilhelm Wundt, born 1832 and died in 1920, was the physician-philosopher who established psychology as an academic discipline. He did not follow his people, the future generations of psychologists, entirely into the land of science, but he made possible psychology's recognition as an independent discipline. Going to the settings. As we have been learning, psychology has diverse institutional origins. In this chapter, we are concerned primarily with the establishment of psychology as an academic discipline and as an experimental science. Although today we take the idea of experimental science for granted, it was, in fact, a novel development of the 19th and 20th centuries. Newton had built physics more on observations of the heavens than on experimentation, though he was an avid experimenter in alchemy and optics. Chemistry and physiology were just emerging in the 19th century, and the systematic application of experimentation in medicine would not come until 1948. When the first controlled clinical trial of a drug, streptomycin, was published. It was thus a bold and daring move when Wundt proposed that psychology, traditionally the province of philosophy, become an experimental science. To understand the shape and fate of the first experimental psychology, we must examine the place of its birth, the German university, and the unique values of those educated there. The German University, Wissenschaft and Bildung. Napoleon's victory over the Prussians at the Battle of Jena in 1806 changed the world, albeit not in ways that the emperor would have hoped or expected, because it led to the creation of the modern research university. Defeated on the field of battle, the Prussian Kaiser resolved to thoroughly modernize his nation, including educating its citizens. Launching his project, Frederick William III said, "The state must replace with intellectual strength what it has lost in material resources." His Ministry of Education asked scholars to conceive and build a new model university, the University of Berlin, founded between 1807 and 1810. With the unification in 1871 of the German states and Bismarck's Second German Empire, the University of Berlin became the model for the other German universities, and eventually for the world. Heretofore, in Germany and elsewhere, higher education had mostly aimed at the training of 3 professions: physicians, lawyers, and clergy. There was no recognized class of scientists and scholars, and most early scientists were supported, as artists were, by wealthy patrons or by the Royal Scientific Societies of Britain and France. Natural philosophers in European colleges and universities preferred to expound Aristotle's science rather than test it with evidence. In the United States, there were no universities before the Civil War. Instead, what? There were no what was Harvard? What? I'm so confused. Okay, in the United States, there were no universities before the Civil War. Instead, there were small church-supported colleges devoted to the higher education of a few of the young men and women of a particular Christian denomination. Very few people pursued higher education anywhere, and except for those aspiring to one of the three learned professions, college was not seen as the entrance to a career pathway, but as a means of preparing for entrance into polite, educated society. The Kaiser's new university was a genuine innovation that ultimately made universities important engines of national advancement worldwide. Going up here to figure 8.1, William Wundt, who is seated in the picture, is with colleagues in his psychological laboratory, the first of its kind. Although in the long run, Wundt's psychological ideas have had little influence, he must be recognized as the founder of psychology as an experimental science. Continuing here. The plan for the new model university was drawn up by Wilhelm von Humboldt, born 1767 and died in 1835. Humboldt proclaimed two aims for the university: Wissenschaft and Bildung. Wissenschaft is usually translated as science, but this is misleading. Wissenschaft referred to any body of knowledge organized on definite principles, and fields such as history or philology counted as Wissenschaften, along with physics or physiology. Indeed, the new university adopted its vehicle for graduate training, the seminar from philology. In philological seminars, a few students worked closely under the direction of an established master of the field. This humanistic model became the basis for the organization of scientific research laboratories, such as Wundt's. Bildung was a uniquely German concept, referring to a person's self-formation through broad humanistic education. Smith defines Bildung this way: the word denotes the value in a person of wholeness, integration, a state in which every part of education and life contributes to the pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful. It is an ideal personal quality, but also the quality that makes possible the high culture of a nation. In his proposal, Humboldt referred to it as the spiritual and moral training of the nation. The products of Bildung were the Bildungsbürgers, culturally educated citizens. Go into the comments. Abdullah Siraj says, Assalamu alaikum, brother. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hopefully everything is all blessed with you out there. And my computer shut down. As soon as I get that message, my computer shuts down. Anyway, hope you're doing well out there. I don't know why my computer just restarted. That's strange. It's fully charged. Anyway, so the products of Bildung were the Bildungsbürgers, culturally educated citizens. They were perhaps the closest realization in any society of Plato's utopian vision of the guardians, the specially educated rulers of the republic who defined themselves by the forms of the beautiful, the true, and the good. Going up to box 8.1, modernizing the academy. The new German university was the first institution to be fully modernized from its pre-modern condition, not only chronologically, but also because of how it came into being. Earlier institutions, including institutions of higher learning, had just grown haphazardly, but the new German university, the emblematic one was the University of Berlin, was self-consciously planned to be a factory of knowledge. A funny example of how knowledge just grew in medieval universities came to me in Britain, when I found that their libraries had just put books on the shelves as they came in, so that books on totally unconnected topics sat next to one another. If one wanted to search for books by topic, librarians pointed to the big library of the U.S. Congress volumes that listed the titles of the books according to its system. Locating a title in it, one then had to go to the shelf list of the books in the British Library and go hiking all over the Cambridge or Oxford campus in search of the actual books. I couldn't even use the University of Edinburgh library because it was changing from the medieval to the modern Library of Congress system, and the books were in piles all over the place. Just dysfunctional, just ghetto. Oxford, Cambridge, just ghetto. The key change associated with modernization is secularization and the decline of the authority of the church and the rise of the authority of the state in science. In the professional world, this change began at the University of Göttingen in the early 18th century, before Humboldt's massive reforms. Medieval universities were part of the church, and theology was the queen of the sciences. But at Göttingen, theology was demoted. Academic freedom, as we understand it, was created there when the theology faculty lost its right to censor the work of the rest of the faculty. The moment was the pivot for the great turn in German life, which moved its center of gravity from religion to the state. Göttingen also elevated the importance of non-theological subjects such as science and psychology. As in all pre-modern institutions, one got ahead in life through personal connections. Young faculty dined with senior professors, and one sure way to get tenure was to marry a professor's daughter. Under Prussian reforms, however, German universities became thoroughly bureaucratized. Professors' work began to be evaluated quantitatively by counting the number of students who took their courses and their research publications. Romanticism had an impact too. Pre-modern professors were expected to profess, to lecture on the great classical texts in their field, commenting on them, what had been said about them over the centuries. If a professor became well known, it was time to write his life work, a textbook that more or less summarized his lectures. A textbook of this type was seen as a contribution to the slowly accumulating body of knowledge in his field. Romanticism, however, was modernist. It sought to break with the past to celebrate the revolutionary, the creative, the breakthrough insight. Okay, that has to be a typo, because breakthrough makes no sense. Anyway, while you don't think of professors or scientists as passionate geniuses like Byron, Romanticism changed the nature of the university research. It became expected that scholars would do novel, revolutionary work, overturning established consensus, the opposite of the textbook model. As Romantic poets had changed the concept of the poem and authors the concept of the novel. This romantic quest for new and surprising findings helped create the replication crisis in psychology we will consider later. I guess that explains somewhat why universities are so obsessed with research and writing and, what knowledge will you produce? You know what I mean? I guess it works for some people. I know there are some people that would much rather just do commentary and writing and reviews and that sort of stuff rather than, constantly try to reinvent the wheel. That seems to be a constant pressure in academia. What new knowledge will you produce? Come on, Maybe I don't want to produce anything. Maybe I just want to talk about what came before me, Anyway, I'm just resetting my computer over here so I can get the chat open and read what y'all are saying if anybody comes in here. Now I got it open. Don't know why my computer just shut down. That was strange. But anyway, continuing here. Continuing here in this section. So there was tension between these two goals from the outset. How can the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, scholarship and scientific research, aid the spiritual growth of the citizenry? Humboldt tried to unify the goals of research and Bildung by relating them to three coordinated aims of the new university. The first was deriving everything from an original principle, the goal of Wissenschaft. Second was relating everything to an ideal, the goal of philosophy. And the third was unifying this ideal and the principle in a single idea, so that science will serve justice in the state and society, also a goal of philosophy. Note the pivotal role played by philosophy in Humboldt's scheme. To the philosopher belonged the job of providing foundations for and synthesizing all knowledge, whether scientific or humanistic, into a single unified view of the world. Weltanschauung. My German is horrible. Anyway, into a single unified view of the world in the service of high moral and social ideals. Economically, the German university rested on the training of teachers for the German gymnasia, academically oriented high schools for the rising middle classes. To pass the difficult licensing examinations, prospective gymnasium teachers needed to be rigorously educated in all fields of study, from literature to physics, and the tuition they paid was the economic basis of the new universities. As teachers, they then contributed to the Bildung of their students. From 1866 onward, psychology was included as part of the curriculum in philosophy and pedagogy. The tension between humanistic cultivation of character and scientific and scholarly cultivation of specialized research areas became apparent in the teacher's curriculum. As the 19th century progressed, the curriculum shifted from emphasizing broad humanistic education to mastery of a specific field. The development of psychology in German universities would be strongly affected by the institutional goals of Bildung and Wissenschaft. Humboldt's stress on scientific research made the German universities uniquely open to the creation of new arenas for scientific investigation. At the same time, it was moving to the forefront of the Second Industrial Revolution. There were two industrial revolutions, the first one in the late 18th century in Britain and a second one from about 1860, taking place in the rest of Europe and in North America. It was this second revolution that transformed the world, creating modernity and modernism. Psychology as an institution or even as a concept scarcely existed prior to the middle of the 19th century. Psychology was very much part of the second industrial revolution, its growth almost perfectly tracking the growth in wealth found in figure 1.4. Psychology was a response to modernity and a shaper of modernism. At the same time, psychology's growth in Germany would be inhibited by the tension between specialized scholarship and broad spiritual education. Academics of Wundt's generation, who built the German universities, were committed to the unification of scholarship and research with humanistic Bildung. They tried to be true to Humboldt's vision, developing overarching systems of thought that coordinated philosophy, the humanities, and the sciences in the service of a single idea. Wundt and others saw psychology as part of philosophy, not as a natural science. However, by the turn of the century, Bildung and system building were honored more in ceremonial speeches than in actual practice. Scholars and scientists devoted themselves to specialized technical studies instead. The second generation of psychologists worked to make psychology an autonomous natural science, freeing it from the handmaiden of philosophy. Freeing it from being the handmaiden of philosophy. However, philosophers and humanists resented the intrusion of science into their traditional domains, and the Ministry of Education placed no great value on making psychology an autonomous science because it did not fit comfortably into the professional education of the Bildungsbürger. The science of physiology belonged with medicine, whose professional aims it served. Sciences like chemistry and physics served the development of German industry. Psychology became something of an orphan, unwanted by the philosophers but unable to find a new home anywhere else. Now going to figure 8.2, this Google Ngram image shows the incidence of the word psychology in books from 1500 to the present in English language texts. We see that aside from a few isolated references, use of the term takes off only after about 1860, when Fechner published Elements of Psychophysics, and Wundt created the first psychology department in 1879. Continuing here. German values, the Mandarin Bildungsbürger. The historian Fritz Ringer has drawn a parallel between the cultural leaders of Germany, the Bildungsbürgers, and the Mandarins who ruled Confucian China. The Mandarins were a self-defined intellectual elite based on deep education in Chinese culture, especially poetry. A young man entered the Mandarin class by passing a sort of civil service examination, but it was an examination on Chinese language and culture, not on managerial or bureaucratic skills. The Mandarins prized pure scholarship for its own sake and prided themselves on working only with their minds, not their hands, disdaining what the Bildungsbürgers derided as mere handwork. The Mandarin emphasis on scholarship inhibited in China the development of science and technology, and in Germany the growth of applied psychology. The Bildungsbürgers saw themselves as an educated elite based on deep education in German culture. Observing from England, the author Matthew Arnold, who lived from 1822 to 1888, noted, "What I admire in Germany is that while there, too, industrialism is making most successful and rapid sort of progress, the idea of culture of the only true sort, is in Germany a living power also." Moreover, German intellectuals saw themselves as uniquely suited to the highest forms of scholarship. Discussing the achievements of German theology in 1906, Albert Schweitzer, born 1875 and died in 1965, wrote, "Nowhere save in the German temperament can there be found in the same perfection the living complex of conditions and factors, of philosophic thought, critical acumen, historical insight, and religious feeling, without which no deep theology is possible." The values of the Mandarin elite powerfully shaped German psychology, making its ideas, though not its methods, unexportable. A revealing window on the mental world of the Bildungsbürger can be found in the distinction between Gemeinschaft, community, and Gesellschaft, society, made by the German sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies, who lived from 1855 and died in 1936. Gemeinschaft embraced everything the Bildungsbürgers loved and valued. Gesellschaft, everything they feared and hated. Gemeinschaft was a genuine community of a single ethnic group sharing a common language, culture, and geographical roots, idealized by the polis of ancient Greece. Because of these common ties, a community formed an organic whole, a single Volk or race. A society was merely an agglomeration of isolated individuals lacking any common tie beyond citizenship and a superficial veneer of merely civilized manners. The city, especially new cities such as Berlin, epitomized the evils of society. Cities are inhabited by strangers, immigrants who have uprooted themselves from their native places to pursue solitary, primarily commercial ambitions. As educated people, the Bildungsbürgers did not reject mind and reason as such. Instead, they were infused with the romantic and Kantian rejection of the kind of narrow, calculating reason they saw in Newton and Hume. Indeed, for many German Mandarins, Newtonian science was the enemy of the good, the true, and the beautiful. It depicted the universe as a mere machine whose motions could be mathematically calculated, lacking anything spiritual or refined. Science gave rise to industrialization, and machines and factories replaced humans and organic connections to blood and soil. Moreover, composed of mere isolated parts, machines and societies can fall apart into chaos and anarchy. The education of Bildung was meant to be an education for living in a true community. As a socialist writer put it, the purpose of Bildung was to develop all the seeds of one's selfhood, but in the service of the whole. Psychology's German founder, Wilhelm Wundt, wrote that the national state serves ideal purposes of absolute value, purposes with respect to which the life of the individual has no value at all. As a matter of intellectual history, the values of the Bildungsbürgers originated in Romanticism, Kantian idealism, and the counter-enlightenment of Herder. Their desire for wholeness was also rooted in the political and social experiences of 19th century Germany. Before 1871, Germany was an idea, not a political state, such as France or Britain. German-speaking people lived all over Middle Europe, but lived in small, even tiny, quasi-feudal states, the largest of which was Prussia. The German people longed for unification into a greater German whole, and they placed such great value on learning German culture and cultivating the German language because these provide a unification in spirit, if not in political fact. Led by Bismarck, Prussia used war to create a German empire, bringing unity to most German peoples, but not the unity the Bildungsbürgers longed for. Bismarck ruled his Kaiser's new Reich by blood and iron, not by scholarship and culture. Ironically, the Bildungsbürgers were not Mandarins in the Chinese sense because they did not rule Germany as they had hoped to do. German professors gained academic freedom by giving up their political ambitions. At the same time, urbanization and industrialization, which fueled the Prussian war machine, undermined the values of Gemeinschaft, threatening to turn the new German Reich into a Gesellschaft that might tip over into chaos. Economic development threatened to overturn traditional rural German culture and replace it with an urban landscape of selfish bourgeoisie individuals. Echoing Greek disdain for the pursuit of self-interest, German industrialist and politician Walter Rathenau, born 1838 and died in 1916, Rathenau wrote, "Any thinking person will walk with horror through the streets and see the department stores, shops, and warehouses. Most of what is stored, elegantly displayed, and dearly sold is terribly ugly, serves demeaning lusts, and is actually stupid, harmful, worthless, meaningless, and wasteful." Okay. Shout out to Kamal up in the chat. Pound sign to you, Kamal. Yeah. Shout out to my guy. Anyway, continuing here. Part of the horror for the Bildungsbürgers was precisely that such goods were popular. They were thinking people guided by ideals. The customers in the shops were members of the unthinking but numerous productive class of Plato's Republic, guided only by the utilitarian pursuit of pleasure. World War I brought Germans' hopes for unity and larger purposes to a fevered pitch of exaltation and then, in defeat, dashed them utterly. In 1914, theologian and historian Ernst Trost, born 1865 and died in 1923, voiced the enthusiasm he and his fellow Mandarin academics felt upon the outbreak of war. As it seemed to bring the national unity and Greek-like service of the state that the Mandarins longed for. The first victory we won, even before the victories on the battlefield, was the victory over ourselves. A higher life seemed to reveal itself to us. Each of us lived for the whole, and the whole lived in all of us. Our own ego, with its personal interest, was dissolved in the great historic being of the nation. The fatherland calls, the parties disappear. Thus, a moral elevation of the people preceded the war. The whole nation was gripped by the truth and reality of a supra-personal spiritual power. Wundt shared Trost's enthusiasm. Academic patriots of the lectern wrote violently anti-English and anti-American tracts, sharpening the difference between German community and the societies to the West. Above all, they despised America as the emblem of Gesellschaft, a nation comprising commercially minded immigrants, sharing no deep culture, no rootedness in the soil. For Wundt and other German intellectuals, Americans and their English cousins were, in the words of Werner Sombart, mere traders who regarded the whole existence of man on earth as a sum of commercial transactions which everyone makes as favorably as possible for himself. Wundt excoriated them for their egoistic utilitarianism, materialism, positivism, and pragmatism. The German ideal, on the other hand, was the hero, a warrior whose ideals were sacrifice, faithfulness, openness, respect, courage, religiosity, charity, and willingness to obey. The highest value of Anglo-Americans was seen as personal comfort, while that of the German was seen as sacrifice and service to a greater whole. For Wundt, the point of life was not happiness, but the production of objects of intellectual value, precisely the products that he, as a German professor, churned out. Interesting, very interesting. World War I was, however, a disaster for Germany, delivering the very chaos Germans feared. As they were defeated on the battlefield, riots, revolt, and finally revolution broke out, replacing the Reich with a republic governed not by blood and iron, but by votes. However, the Weimar Republic was forever tainted by its birth in the defeat of the Great War, and German intellectuals never fully supported it. Moreover, instead of unification, democracy brought chaos and rule by unthinking, atomized citizens, divided into political factions and even private armies of disgruntled soldiers. The Freikorps, with such fragile foundations, the Weimar Republic failed, and in 1933 was replaced by the totalitarian unity of Hitler and the Nazis. Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer. One empire, one people, one leader. German psychology was shaped by Bildungsbürger values. Psychology is the science most directly concerned with human nature, and it was torn between its alliance with materialistic science on the one hand, and on the other, the German hope that there was more to human beings than brain, consciousness, and behavior. Wundt founded psychology as a science within philosophy, but as his career developed, he placed limits on what psychology could do as a natural science, setting uniquely human achievements such as culture and language, key aspects of Gemeinschaft, outside the purview of experimental psychology. Similarly, Wundt was torn between the atomistic view of consciousness that seemed most compatible with science and the holistic vision of the universe he shared with his fellow Mandarins. He argued that consciousness was composed of elements, but that they were unified into larger wholes by the synthesizing power of the human will. The second and third generation of German psychologists struggled with the conflict between Mandarin values and modern life, the life of industry and urbanization. Most psychologists wanted to move psychology completely into the realm of natural science, and some wanted psychology to become an applied field. These goals were resisted by the entrenched power of philosophy and the high value the Mandarins placed on pure scholarship. As modern life seemed to tend even more toward the machine, industrialization, and chaos, urbanization, reconciling science and humanistic values became increasingly difficult. Nevertheless, the Gestalt psychologists attempted it, claiming to find in nature, in the brain, and in consciousness organized wholes. Gestalten. Organized wholes. Gestalten. The satisfyingly transcended. Nevertheless, the Gestalt psychologists attempted it, claiming to find in nature, in the brain, and in consciousness organized wholes that satisfyingly transcended their atomic constituents, otherwise Gestalten. All right. William Wundt's Psychology of Consciousness. On to William Wundt, again, who was born in 1832, died in 1920. Wilhelm Wundt was the founder of psychology as an institution. His ideas were not especially original and did not survive into the second generation of even German psychologists. He took the already established path through physiology, accepting the Cartesian Lockean way of ideas as the basis for making psychology a science, suitably linked to physiology. His enduring innovations were methodological and institutional rather than theoretical. He wrote a compendious text on physiological psychology. One more time. He wrote a compendious text on physiological psychology that laid out in arresting detail the path through physiology for scientific psychology. He created the first academically recognized laboratory in psychology. He founded the first journal in experimental psychology. In sum, Wundt remade psychology from a fitful enterprise of solitary scholars into a genuine scientific community. Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt was born on August 16, 1832, in Neckarau, Baden, Germany, the fourth child of a minister, Maximilian Wundt, and his wife, Mary Frederick. He was born into the intellectual Mandarin elite. On both sides of his family were to be found intellectuals, scientists, professors, government officials, and physicians. At the age of 13, Wundt began his formal education at a Catholic gymnasium. He disliked school and failed, but he transferred to another gymnasium in Heidelberg, from which he graduated in 1851. Wundt decided to go into medicine, and after an initially poor start, he applied himself and excelled in his studies. His scientific interest emerged in physiological research. He got an MD summa cum laude in 1855, and after some study with the physiologist Johannes Müller, received in 1857 the second doctorate that German universities required before one could be licensed to teach at the university level. He gave his first course in experimental physiology to 4 students in his mother's apartment in Heidelberg. Wundt applied for and received an assistantship with Hermann von Helmholtz. Although Wundt admired Helmholtz, they were never close, and Wundt eventually rejected Helmholtz's materialism. While with Helmholtz, Wundt gave his first course in psychology as a natural science in 1862, and his first important writings began to appear. He worked his way up the academic ladder at Heidelberg while dabbling in politics, for the first and last time as an idealistic socialist. He got married in 1872. His publications continued, including the first edition of his fundamental work, Grundzüge der Psychologie and Psychologie. Whatever. Principle of Physiological Psychology in 1873 and 1874. This work, in its many editions, propounded the central tenets of his experimental psychology and excited supporters of scientific psychology around the world. After a year in a waiting room position in Zurich, Wundt received a chair in philosophy at Leipzig, where he taught from 1875 to 1917. At Leipzig, Wundt won a degree of independence for psychology by founding his Psychological Institute. Beginning as a purely private institute in 1879, he supported it out of his own pocket until 1881. Finally, in 1885, it was officially recognized by the university and listed in the catalog. It began as a primitive one-room affair and expanded over the years. In 1897, it moved to its own specially designed building, later destroyed during World War II. During the years at Leipzig, Wundt continued his extraordinary output, supervising at least 200 dissertations, teaching over 24,000 students, and writing or revising volume after volume, as well as overseeing and writing for the psychological journal he founded. All right. In 1900, Wundt began a massive undertaking, the publication of his Volker Psychology, which was completed only in 1920, the year of his death. In this work, Wundt developed what he believed was the other half of psychology, the study of the individual in society as opposed to the individual in the laboratory. Wundt's work continued to the last. His final undertaking was his Reminiscences, titled Erlebtes and Erkanntes, which he completed only a few days before he died on August 31st, 1920, at the age of 88. Wundt's psychology, making psychology a science, the path through physiology. In the work that first defined scientific psychology, Principles of Physiological Psychology, published in 1873, Wundt proclaimed an alliance between two sciences. The first was physiology, which informs us about those life phenomena that we perceive by our external senses. The second was psychology, in which the person looks upon himself from within. The result of the alliance was to be a new science, physiological psychology, whose tasks were first to investigate those life processes or consciousness that, standing midway between external and internal experiences, require the simultaneous application of both methods of observation, the external and the internal, and second, to throw light upon the totality of life processes from the points of view gained by investigations of this area, and in this way, perhaps to mediate a total comprehension of human existence. This new science begins with the physiological processes and seeks to demonstrate how these influences the domain, This new science begins with physiological processes and seeks to demonstrate how these influence the domain of internal observation. The name physiological psychology points to psychology as the real subject of our science. If one wishes to place emphasis on methodological characteristics, our sciences might be called experimental psychology, in distinction from the usual science of mind based purely on introspection. Here we find Wundt transforming the Cartesian Lockean way of ideas from philosophical speculation into science. Descriptively, psychology rested on introspective observation of the world of ideas, attempting to isolate and define the mental elements of which complex ideas are constituted, and the mental processes that bring the elements together into the coherent, meaningful objects of naive experience. Then these elements and processes were to be linked to their physiological substrates. Wundt's alliance was more than a plan for research, and a culmination of the ideas of centuries of physician philosophers. It also provided a strategy by which his fledgling field might make its way in the academic world, serving several important functions in psychology's struggle for existence. The first functions concerned methodology, both broadly and narrowly defined. Although in Wundt's time the word physiology was acquiring the biological meaning it has today, it still possessed a broader and different meaning. Physiology and physics have the same Greek root, physis, and in the 19th century the word physiology was often used simply to designate taking an experimental approach to a subject. More specifically, in the case of psychology, apparatus and techniques such as reaction time measurement were taken over from physiology and put to use in psychology laboratories. Because of the important methodological aspect of the alliance, Wundt also called physiological psychology experimental psychology. In the previous quoted passage, Wundt alluded to a second set of functions of the alliance between physiology and psychology. At a philosophical level, the alliance helped psychology become part of the aggressively emerging naturalistic worldview of science. Traditionally, psychology meant psyche logos, the study of the soul. But the supernatural soul had no place in naturalistic science, so continuing to pursue psychology along traditional lines would bar it from science on the grounds of unscientific dualism. However, by insisting that the nervous system is the basis of all mentality, and by defining psychology as the investigation of the physiological conditions of conscious events, the new field of physiological psychology could establish itself as a science. For example, the most important mental process in Wundt's psychology was apperception, and Wundt proposed the existence of an apperception center in the brain. In addition, psychologists could borrow established physiological concepts such as the threshold and neural excitation and inhibition and use them in psychological theories. One theoretical possibility opened up by the creation of physiological psychology was reduction, not simply borrowing physiological concepts for psychological usage, but explaining mental and behavioral events in terms of physiological causes. To take a familiar modern example, it appears that the cause of long-term depression is disordered levels of certain neurotransmitters in the brain rather than repressed psychological conflicts. All three of the main founders of psychology, Wundt, Freud, and James, were initially attracted by the idea of jettisoning psychological theories altogether in favor of explaining consciousness as the outcome of neural causes, without positing a level of unconscious mediating psychological processes. Ultimately, all three rejected the reductive vision because reduction might turn into replacement. Wundt moved very slowly away from reduction. Freud was briefly enchanted with the idea, and James struggled mightily with it, eventually giving up psychology for philosophy. Nevertheless, the idea of reduction lived on in the succeeding generations of psychologists, sometimes hidden but never dying. And today it is reasserting itself with new vigor in the field of cognitive neuroscience. The last function of the alliance between physiological psychology and psychology was a tactical move in the academic politics of 19th century Germany. Physiology was the most recently established scientific discipline. Its practitioners, such as Hermann von Helmholtz, with whom Wundt studied, were among the world's leading scientists, and its rapid progress soon gave it enormous prestige. For an ambitious academic like Wundt, the champion of a new field seeking funds, space, and students, alliance with physiology was a way to gain respectability. Continuing here, Wundt's two systems of psychology, Heidelberg and Leipzig, conceiving psychology. Instead of the narrow expertise expected of most modern professors in the pursuit of Bildung, the Mandarins of the 19th century strove to coordinate ideas of different disciplines and to subsume them into a single comprehensive scheme of human life. James called them heaven-scaling titans, and we see just a hint of Wundt as a heaven-scaling titan in the opening of the 1873 edition of Principles of Physiological Psychology, when he offered the hope that physiological psychology might mediate a total comprehension of human existence. As a good Mandarin, Wundt was thoroughly in the grasp of the will to system, and conceived of psychology as but one component in a grand scheme of human knowledge. Although the personalities of Wundt and Freud are, in other respects, as different as night and day, they shared a trait necessary to a founder of a general system of thought. They were both ambitious hedgehogs. What is a hedgehog in this case? Is there a note? There's no footnote here. What does he mean by hedgehog? Anyway, they were both ambitious hedgehogs. Freud, as we shall see, called himself a conquistador. James observed that Wundt aims at being a sort of Napoleon of the mind. For a century, Freud succeeded in conquering the world in the name of a few salient ideas. Wundt, however, seemed to have no central theme. James called him a Napoleon without genius and with no central idea, which, if defeated, brings down the whole fabric in ruins. Cut him up like a worm, and each fragment crawls. There is no vital node, in his medulla oblongata, so you can't kill him all at once. Wundt offered to the world two different systems of psychology. He formulated the first at Heidelberg, but came to repudiate it later as a sin of my youthful days, as Freud later repudiated and tried to suppress his early project for a scientific psychology. Wundt's second program, propounded in Leipzig, changed significantly over the years. What remained constant was Wundt's traditional definition of psychology as a study of the mind and the search for the laws that govern it. But his assumptions about the mind and the methods used to investigate it changed dramatically. Wundt's Heidelberger program conceived of psychology as a natural science. Echoing John Stuart Mill's sentiments, Wundt wrote that the mind could be brought within the ambit of natural science by experimental method. It has been the experiment only that has made progress in the natural sciences possible. Let us then apply the experiment to the nature of the mind. In his early definition of psychology, Wundt did not identify the mind with consciousness, as he did later. Rather, the goal of experimentation was to gather data permitting inferences about unconscious processes. The experiment in psychology is the major means which guides us from the facts of consciousness to those processes which, in the dark background of our mind, prepare conscious life. Wundt was called to Leipzig, however, as a philosopher, to lecture in philosophy, to build a philosophical system, and to conduct psychology as part of philosophy. In the Mandarin German university system, philosophy held sway, and Wundt had to find a new place for psychology in the Mandarin scheme of knowledge. In the spirits of Herder and Vico, German intellectuals typically distinguish between Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft. Nature Geisteswissenschaft translates straightforwardly as natural science, the study of the physical world and the search for the laws that govern it. Geisteswissenschaft is a more difficult concept. A literal translation is spiritual science. Geist means spirit. But what was meant was a study of the human world created by human history and the search for laws governing human life, human development, and human history. In the medieval Neoplatonic conception of the universe, human beings stood betwixt the material world and the spiritual world, half bodily animal and half divine soul. In the scheme of Vico, Herder, and their followers, human beings occupied a similar position, betwixt the material world and the social world. In each case, the human body and the elementary mental functions humans share with animals belong to the world of matter and natural science, and the higher reaches of the human mind, the soul for Christians, the higher mental processes for scientific psychology, belong to the world of Geist and the Geisteswissenschaften. Thus, psychology forms the transition from the nature to the Geisteswissenschaften, the experimental methods of physiological psychology, which study those aspects of consciousness close to sensation and motor response, lead to an approach that is related to the methodology of the physical sciences. On the other hand, above these elementary phenomenon rise the higher mental processes, which are the ruling forces in history as well as in society. Thus they, on their side, require a scientific analysis, which approaches those of the special Geisteswissenschaften. Over the years, the Leipzig program changed. Solomon Diamond has translated the introductory passages of Wundt's Principles of Physiological Psychology from its first edition in 1873 to its last edition in 1908 and 1911. As edition supplanted edition, the strength of Wundt's alliance between physiology and psychology was weakened. In the early editions, psychology was linked, as we have seen, reductively as well as methodologically, to physiology. The study of the nervous system was expected to shed light on the nature of human consciousness. However, by the fourth edition in 1893, only the methodological link remained, and physiological psychology had come to mean only experimental psychology. Like Freud and James, Wundt moved away from seeing psychology as a simple extension of physiology. Ironically, although Wundt himself came to reject his Heidelberg system as a youthful error, his students and readers worldwide embrace its definition of psychology as an autonomous natural science. Wundt's Leipzig system, tied to the peculiar German Mandarin view of the world, the mind, and education, proved to be a historical failure. Research methods for psychology. Wundt carefully defined the new methods on which scientific psychology should be built. The preeminent method was introspection, but a new experimentally controlled introspection based on the model developed by Fechner replaced philosophical armchair introspection. Old-fashioned philosophical psychology had used armchair introspection to reveal the contents and workings of the mind, but it had fallen into bad odor among some scientists and philosophers as unreliable and subjective. Wundt agreed with those critiques of introspection, recognizing that a science of consciousness could be erected only on objective, replicable results based on standardized conditions capable of duplication and systematic variation. Precisely to achieve these aims, he introduced physiological, that is, experimental techniques into the hitherto philosophical realm of psychology. Wundt distinguished between two means of psychological observation whose German names were unfortunately both rendered into English as introspection, giving rise to passages in which Wundt both condemns introspection and commends it as the fundamental method of psychology. Inner Wahrnehmung, or internal perception, referred to the pre-scientific method of armchair subjective introspection as practiced, for example, by Descartes and Locke. This kind of introspection is carried out in a haphazard, uncontrolled way and cannot hope to yield results useful to a scientific psychology. On the other hand, experimental self-observation, designated a scientifically valid form of introspection in which observers are exposed to standard, repeatable situations and are asked to describe the resulting experience. The experimenter arranges the situation and collects the observer's report of what he or she finds in consciousness, the way an astronomer's assistant might record the observations made by an astronomer peering through a telescope at Jupiter. The rationale and limits of experimental introspection changed as Wundt's systematic definition of psychology changed. In the Heidelberger years, when Wundt believed in unconscious psychological processes, traditional introspection was rejected because it was limited to observation of unconsciousness and could not, by definition, reveal the workings of the unconscious. Careful experimentation, Wundt held, might reveal phenomena from which the workings of unconsciousness might be deduced. During this period, Wundt assigned the introspective method a wider scope of application than he would later. In his Heidelberg years, Wundt stated that it is mere prejudice to regard it as futile to attempt to penetrate into the realm of the higher mental processes by means of experimental methods. Later, when Wundt rejected the existence of the unconscious, experimentation was valued as making it possible to recreate the same experience in different observers or in the same observers at different times. This emphasis on exact duplication of experiences severely limited the realm of experimental introspection to the simplest mental processes, and Wundt duly excluded the study of the higher mental processes from Wundt duly excluded the study of the higher mental processes from physiological psychology, completely reversing his Heidelberg stance. The Leipzig restrictions on introspection were also consistent with Kantian idealism. Kant set the transcendental ego outside the possibility of experience, restricting introspection, as Wundt now did, to the most superficial aspects of the mind, immediate conscious experience. Alongside experimental introspection, Wundt recognized other methods of psychological investigation. The method of experimental introspection was, by its nature, limited to the study of normal minds of human adults, that is, the minds of experimental observers. Alongside experimental introspection, Wundt recognized comparative psychological and historical psychological methods. Both methods involve the study of mental differences. The comparative method applied to the study of consciousness in animals, children, and the disturbed. The historical method applied to mental differences as determined by race and nationality. The relations among the study of normal adult, animal, disturbed, and historically conditioned consciousness shifted over the years. But the most general change was in the importance Wundt assigned to the historical method, or Volcker psychology. Wundt always believed, as did Freud, in the biogenetic law, that the development of the individual recapitulated the evolution of the species. In keeping with his notions, Wundt held that the best way to construct a theory of psychological development in individuals was to study the historical development of the human race. In his earliest program of psychology, the historical method was put forward as an adjunct to the main method of psychology, experimental introspection. However, when Wundt repositioned psychology as the crucial discipline lying between Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft, the historical method was elevated to parity with the experimental method. The experimental method faced toward Naturwissenschaft, applying to the more strictly physiological aspects of the mind. The historical method faced toward Geisteswissenschaft, applying to the inner processes of mental creativity revealed in history, especially through language, myth, and custom. Thus, when Wundt withdrew experimental introspection from the study of the higher mental processes, consistent with the most influential German philosophy, Kantian idealism, which denied that people have access to the transcendental ego, he replaced it with the historical method of Volcker psychology. Together, experimental method plus Volcker psychology would furnish a complete, albeit not completely natural, scientific psychology. All right, we're going to take a break right here. Going to take a break. We've made great progress. We're on page 231, 232, and I believe this chapter goes all the way to 254. So we only have about, 20 more pages to go, and we started off on page 217, 219. So yeah, we've read quite a lot so far today, close to 20 pages. We only have about 20 odd pages left to go. So we're going to take a break right here, a little smoke break, water break, bathroom break, come back, and we're going to knock out these remaining 20 pages. If you're watching this on the playback, weeks from now, months from now, years from now, there might be an edit at this point where we jump ahead 10 minutes or so and just start reading here. But if you're watching this live, there's going to be about 10 minutes or 15 minutes so of dead air that I will edit out later, hopefully, when I have the time. Hopefully you're enjoying this live stream. Any comments, put them in the chat. I will try to get to them. Let me know what y'all are thinking about this text. And we are back. This is part 2 of episode 18 of our 17th book in our Books React series, A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity. I took a short break, about 20 minutes. Hopefully you did too. Or if you're listening to this on the playback, hopefully you're excited to continue where we left off on reading this fabulous textbook. We are now continuing on our study of William Wundt and his work in psychology. We're starting here on page 231, and we are reading his section on Wilhelm Wundt at work, so how he did his experimental psychology. Let's go. So, Wundt at work. Excuse me, pardon. All right. To illustrate the nature of Wundt's psychology, we shall consider 2 topics taken up in the 2 branches of his psychology. The first applies to the experimental method of physiological psychology to an old question in philosophical psychology. Pardon. How many ideas can consciousness contain at a given moment? The second applies to the method of the Volcker psychology to the question of how human beings create and understand sentences. Physiological psychology. Once one accepts the Cartesian way of ideas, a natural question becomes, how many ideas can the mind hold at once? Traditional philosophical introspection, Wundt held, can provide no reliable answers. Without experimental control, attempting to introspect the number of ideas in one's mind is futile because their content varies from time to time, and we must rely on fallible memories to give us the facts that introspection reports. An experiment, one that would complement and perfect introspection and would yield quantitative results, was called for. The following is an updated and simplified version of Wundt's experiment. Imagine looking at a computer screen. For an instant, about 0.09 seconds, a stimulus is flashed on the screen. This stimulus is a 4-column by 4-row array of randomly chosen letters, and your task is to recall as many letters as possible. What you recall provides a measure of how many simple ideas you can grasp in an instant of time, and so may give an answer to the original question. Wundt found that unpracticed observers could recall about 4 letters. Experienced observers could recall up to 6, but no more. These figures agree with modern results on the capacity of working memory, and that Wundt discovered, and that and what Wundt discovered is now usually known as iconic memory. Two further important phenomena can be observed in this experiment. The first concerns whether the letters are presented as random strings, as in the previous experiment, or as words. Imagine an experiment in which each line of 4 letters forms a word. For example, work, many, room, idea. Under these conditions, one could probably recall all 4 words, or at least 3, for a total of 12 to 16 letters. Similarly, one could quickly read and recall the word miscellaneousness, which contains 17 letters. Letters as isolated elements quickly fill up consciousness so that only 4 to 6 can be perceived in a given moment, but many more can be grasped if these elements are organized. In Wundt's terms, the letter elements are synthesized by apperception into a greater whole, which is understood as a single complex idea and grasped as one new element. Experiments on the large differences between the numbers of letters recalled when they are presented as random strings as opposed to when they are presented as words played a revealing role in debates surrounding Gestalt psychology. Consistent with British empiricism, American psychologists explain the superiority of word organization as the result of association. A word like home has been perceived so frequently that its constituent letters have become associated into a functional unit. Advocates of Gestalt psychology maintained that the word home was a meaningful whole in itself, perceived as such by the mind. Wundt took a middle view consistent with Kantian idealism, that home was a meaningful whole, but that the whole was imposed on the elements by the organizing powers of the mind. The second important finding revealed by Wundt's experiments concerned the perception of letters that the observers did not name. Observers reported that some letters, the ones they named, were perceived clearly and distinctly, but other letters had been presented only dimly and hazily perceived. Consciousness, it seemed, was a large field populated with ideational elements. One area of this field is in the focus of attention, and the idea within it are clearly perceived. The elements lying outside the focal area are only faintly felt as present and cannot be identified. The focus of consciousness is where apperception works, sharpening stimuli into those seen clearly and distinctly. Items outside apperception's focus are apprehended only, they are not seen clearly. Apperception was especially important in Wundt's system. Not only was it responsible for the active synthesis of elements into wholes, but it also accounted for the higher mental activities of analysis, revealing the parts of a whole, and of judgment. It was responsible for the activities of relating and comparing, which are simpler forms of synthesis and analysis. Apperception was the basis for all higher forms of thought, such as reasoning and use of language, and was central to Wundt's psychology in both its individual and social divisions. Wundt's emphasis on apperception displays the voluntaristic nature of his system, when neither mind nor self referred to a special substance for Wundt. To what did he attribute our sense of self? It is the subjective feeling of the unity of experience that provides the answer. Apperception is a voluntary act of the will by which we control and give synthetic unity to our mind. The feeling of activity, control, and unity defined the self. Echoing Kant, Wundt wrote, "What we call ourself is simply the unity of volition plus the universal control of our mental life, which it renders possible." Wundt also studied feelings and emotions, for they are an obvious part of our conscious experience. He often used introspectively reported feelings as clues to what processes were going on in the mind at a given moment. He thought that apperception, for instance, was marked by a feeling of mental effort. Wundt proposed that feelings could be defined along 3 dimensions: pleasant versus unpleasant, high versus low arousal, and concentrated versus relaxed attention. He conducted a long series of studies designed a physiological basis for each dimension, but the results were inconclusive. and other laboratories produced conflicting findings. Modern factor analyses of effect, however, have arrived at similar three-dimensional systems. Wundt emphasized the active, synthesizing power of apperception, but he recognized the existence of passive processes as well, which he classified as various forms of association or passive apperception. There were, for example, assimilations in which a current sensation is assorted to an older element. When one looks at a chair, he or she knows immediately what it is by assimilation, for the current image of the perceived chair is immediately associated with the older universal element, chair. Recognition is a form of assimilation, stretched out into two steps, a vague feeling of familiarity followed by the act of recognition proper. Recollection, on the other hand, was, for Wundt, as for some contemporary psychologists, an act of reconstruction rather than reactivation of old elements. One cannot re-experience an earlier event, for ideas are not permanent. Rather, one reconstructs it from current cues and certain general rules. Finally, Wundt considered abnormal states of consciousness. He discussed hallucinations, depression, hypnosis, and dreams. The psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, born 1856 and died in 1926, studied with Wundt and later revolutionized psychiatry with scientifically based diagnoses. His first studies involved what he called dementia praecox, premature dementia, later called schizophrenia. In his work, Kraepelin was influenced by Wundt's theory of the disease. Wundt proposed that schizophrenia involves a breakdown in attentional processes. The schizophrenic loses the apperceptive control of thoughts characteristic of normal consciousness and surrenders instead to passive associative processes, so that thought becomes a simple train of associations rather than coordinated processes directed by volition, a theory revived in modern times. Oh, it looks like Wundt still has some influence on modern psychology. Interesting. Continuing to Volcker psychology. Especially as Wundt developed his Leipzig system, he taught that experimental individual psychology could not be a complete psychology, and he elevated the comparative historical method to parity with the experimental method. The mind of living individuals are the products of a long course of species development of which each person is ignorant. To understand the development of the mind, then, we must have recourse to history. Wundt held the study of animals and children is limited by their inability to introspect. History expands the range of the individual consciousness. In particular, the range of existing human cultures represents the various stages in cultural and mental evolution, from primitive tribes to civilized nation-states. Volcker psychology is thus the study of the products of collective life, especially of language, myths, and custom. That provides clues to the higher operations of the mind. Wundt said that experimental psychology penetrates only the outworks of the mind. Volcker psychology reaches deeper into the transcendental ego. Emphasis on historical development, a legacy from Vico and Herder, was typical of German intellectuals in the 19th century. In the German view, every individual springs from and has an organic relationship with his or her natal culture. Further, cultures have complex histories that determine their forms and contents. Thus, it was generally believed that history could be used as a method for arriving at an understanding of human psychology and the different mentalities of different ethnic groups. The foundations of racism, I'm telling you. Wundt's remarks on myth and custom were typical of his time. Somewhat like Comte, Wundt proposed that human civilization developed through a series of stages from primitive tribes to an age of heroes, and then to the formation of states, culminating in a world state based on the concept of humanity as a whole. Many 19th century scholars believed that existing societies, which varied in their degrees of economic development, revealed the historical development of humanity. To travel in geographical space from culture to culture was also to travel in time. As the English historian W.E. Leakey, born 1838 and died in 1903, said, "There is still so great a diversity of civilization in existing nations that traversing tracts of space is almost like traversing tracts of time, for it brings us in contact with representatives of nearly every phase of past civilization." By the middle of the 19th century, Wundt was the most famous exponent of the idea that studying existing cultures revealed the evolution of the human mind. It was in the study of language that he made his most substantial contribution, articulating a theory of psycholinguistics that reached conclusions similar to those of psycholinguistics in the 1960s. Language was part of Volker psychology for Wundt because, like myth and custom, it is a product of collective life. With the 18th century thinker Lord Monboddo is a crazy name, Wundt believed that from the study of language, it be properly conducted, the history of the human mind is best learned. Wundt divided language into two aspects: outer phenomenon consisting of actually produced or perceived utterances, and inner phenomenon, the cognitive processes that underlie the outer string of words. This rather Kantian division of psychological phenomenon into inner and outer aspects was first adumbrated by Fechner and was central to Wundt's psychology. Remember, adumbrated is a word that has many meanings, but it just means illustrated. All right? Anyway, the distinction between inner and outer phenomenon is perhaps clearest in the case of language. It is possible to describe language as an organized, associated system of sounds that we speak or hear. This constitutes the outer form of language. However, this outer form is the surface expression of deeper cognitive processes that organize a speaker's thoughts, preparing them for utterance, and enable the listener to extract meaning from what he or she hears. These cognitive processes constitute the inner mental form of speech. Sentence production, according to Wundt, begins with a unified idea that one wishes to express the Gesamtvorstellung, or whole mental configuration. The analytic function of apperception prepares the unified idea for speech, for it must be analyzed into component elements and a given structure that retains the relationship between the parts and the whole. Consider the simple sentence, "The cat is black." The basic structural division in such a sentence is between the subject and predicate and can be represented with the tree diagram introduced by Wundt. If we let G equal Gesamtvorstellung and S subject and P predicate, we have the diagram shown in figure 8.3. Let's go to 8.3. Example of Wundt's analysis of grammatical relations in a sentence. The cat is black. The subject is the cat. The predicate is it's black, and the Gesamtvorstellung is, the idea, I guess, altogether. The idea of a black cat has now been divided into its two fundamental ideas and can be expressed verbally as the cat is black. With the addition of the function words, the is required in our particular language. More complex ideas require more analysis and must be represented by more complex diagrams. The entire process, in all cases, can be described as the transformation of an inexpressible organized whole thought into an expressible sequential structure of words organized in a sentence. The process is reversed in comprehension of speech. Here, the synthesizing rather than analytic function of apperception is called on. The words and grammatical structure in a heard sentence must be used by the hearer to reconstruct in his or her own mind the whole mental configuration that the speaker is attempting to communicate. Wundt supported his view of comprehension by pointing out that we remember the gist of what we hear, but only rarely the surface or outer form, which tends to disappear in the process of constructing the Gesamtvorstellung. We have touched on only a small portion of Wundt's discussion of language. He also wrote on gesture language, the origin of language from involuntary expressive sounds, primitive language, based more on association than on apperception, phonology, and meaning change. Wundt has a fair claim to be the founder of psycholinguistics as well as psychology. Nevertheless, there remains a puzzle about Wundt's Völker psychology, although he seemed in his writings to value it, never trained anyone in its practice. Moreover, it was nearly unreadable and exerted little influence even in Germany, whose Mandarin values it reflected. Outside Germany, it was misrepresented or ignored. After Leipzig, other methods and new movements. Although Wundt launched psychology as a recognized discipline, his Leipzig system did not represent the future of psychology. Wundt is best regarded as a transitional figure, linking psychology's philosophical past to its future as a natural science and as an applied science. Educated when German universities emphasized Bildung and philosophical system building, Wundt always saw psychology as part of philosophy. His students, however, were affected by the increasing success and prestige of the natural sciences and by the tendency toward research specialization that undermined the concept of Bildung. They fought to make psychology an autonomous natural science rather than a mere branch of philosophy. Wundt also resisted making psychology an applied science. As a good Mandarin, Wundt placed pure scholarship above practical success. On this point, too, Wundt's opinion would be overturned. Psychology's future lay with natural science and practical application. Wundt had surprisingly little effect on the next generation of psychologists. The younger German generation established new journals and the Society for Experimental Psychology, but Wundt was conspicuous by his absence and lack of participation. At the founding of this society in 1904, Wundt was honored in a telegram, but he was called the Nestor of experimental psychology. In the Iliad, Nestor, like Polonius in Hamlet, was an allegedly wise but pompous old windbag. Okay, so it looks like Wundt was not very popular with the youngins. Wundt's successors rejected his division of psychology into a natural science, an experimental part, the physiological psychology, and the Völker psychology. The generation after Wundt was much influenced by positivism and believed that if psychology was going to be a science erected on positive facts, the higher mental processes would have to be subjected to experimental study. As early as 1879, Hermann Ebbinghaus, born 1850 and died in 1909, undertook to study the higher mental process of memory. Ebbinghaus's procedure was non-introspective, anticipating the behavioral direction of future psychology. Other psychologists, most notably Wundt's student Oswald Kolb and E.B. Titchener, attempted to observe thinking directly through systematic introspection, a looser, more retrospective probing of consciousness that in some respects resembled psychoanalysis more than experimental psychology. The Gestalt psychologists, too, would study consciousness and behavior, perception, and problem-solving, endeavoring to make psychology a complete and autonomous natural science. Very interesting. I mean, I think, isn't, Wundt's division of psychology sort of similar to like how psychology is practiced today? Völker psychology I would interpret as like social psychology, right? Like how we think as groups. Physiological psychology I would put under the field of like psychiatry and study of how, physical actions or processes in the brain affect our consciousness and our thinking, right? And actions and behaviors. Experimental psychology, to me it sounds like Wundt's foundation is very sound, and the result, the backlash to it, the reactionaryism to positivism in psychology, to me seems wayward, because positivism, at least as far as I'm understanding, is understanding all other fields to just basically be like physics, basically be like hard sciences, right? And applying what we take from those sciences like physics, chemistry, etc., and trying to apply those same methods or understandings in different disparate fields. But anyway, I'm going to continue here. E.B. Titchener's Structural Psychology. Edward Bradford Titchener, born 1867 and died in 1927, was an Englishman who brought German psychology to America, turning British associationism into a psychological research program. He played an important role in the founding of American psychology, contrasting his extreme introspective psychology, structural psychology, with the rising tide of psychology influenced by evolution, functional psychology. To a large extent, Titchener's psychology was the system against which American psychology defined themselves, seeing it as sterile, philosophical, and out of date. Moreover, they tended to see Titchener as Wundt's faithful apostle in the New World, missing important differences between Wundt's German psychology, influenced by Kant and Herder, and Titchener's distinctive scientific version of British psychology. E.B. Titchener was born in 1867 in Chichester, England, and went to Oxford from 1885 to 1890. While at Oxford, his interests shifted from classics and philosophy to physiology. The conjunction of interest in philosophy and physiology naturally predisposed Titchener to psychology, and while at Oxford, he translated the third edition of Wundt's massive Principles of Physiological Psychology. Titchener could find no one in England to train him in psychology, so in 1890 he went to Leipzig, taking his doctorate in 1892. As an Englishman, Titchener arrived in Leipzig from the other side of the intellectual gulf, separating Germany from the West. He was thoroughly versed in philosophy and was much impressed by James Mill, remarking that Mill's speculations could be empirically demonstrated. In his first systematic book, An Outline of Psychology, published in 1897, he wrote, "The general standpoint of my book is that of the traditional English psychology." It is reasonable to expect, therefore, that Titchener may well have assimilated Wundt's German psychology into the traditional English psychology that Wundt rejected. After a short stint as a biology lecturer in England, a country unreceptive to psychology, Titchener left for America to teach at Cornell, where he remained until his death in 1927. He transformed Cornell into a bastion of mentalistic psychology, even as America's focus went first functionalist and then, after 1913, behaviorist. Titchener never compromised with these movements, despite his friendship with the functionalist J.R. Engel and with John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism. He did not participate actively in the American Psychological Association, even when it met at Cornell, preferring instead his own group, the Experimental Psychologists, which he kept true to his version of psychology and which eventually became important to the movement of cognitive psychology in the 1950s and 60s. Titchener apparently possessed a mind in which everything had imaginal, sensational character. He even had an image for such an abstract word as meaning. Titchener wrote, "I see meaning as the blue-gray tip of a kind of scoop, which has a bit of yellow above it, and which is just digging into a dank mass of plastic material." All right, this motherfucker was crazy. Even though he recognized that not everyone had an imaginal mind, as he called it, he built his psychology on the premise that the mind was made up of sensations or images of sensation and nothing. This led to his rejection of various Wundtian concepts, such as apperception, which is inferred rather than observed directly. Titchener's psychology was an extreme, albeit experimental version of British associationism, a kind of physical science of the mental that analyzed ideas and consciousness into component parts as chemists analyze compounds into atomic elements. The first experimental task of Titchener's psychology was thus the discovery of the basic sensation elements to which all complex processes could be reduced. As early as 1897, he drew up a catalog of elements found in the different sense departments. There were, for instance, 30,500 visual elements, 4 taste elements, and 3 sensations in the alimentary canal. Titchener defined elements as the simplest sensations to be found in experience. They were to be discovered through the systematic dissection by introspection of the contents of consciousness. When an experience could not be dissected into parts, it was declared elemental. Titchener's method of introspection was much more elaborate than Wundt's, for it was not a simple report of an experience, but a complicated retrospective analysis of that experience, not much different from the systematic introspection of the Wurzburg school. Titchener wrote, be as attentive as possible to the object or process which rise to the sensation, and when the object is removed or the process completed, recall the sensation by an act of memory as vividly and completely as you can. Persistent application of the method would, in Titchener's view, eventually produce a complete description of the elements of human experience. The task was unfinished and, as many thought, unfinishable when Titchener died. The second task of Titchener's psychology was to determine how the elementary sensations are connected to form complex perceptions, ideas, and images. These connections were not all associations because, for Titchener, an association was a connection of elements that persisted even when the original conditions for the connection could no longer be obtained. Titchener rejected the label of associationism, not only for this reason, but also because the associationists spoke of association of meaningful ideas, not of simple, meaningless sensations, which was all that concerned Titchener. The third task of Titchener's psychology was to explain the workings of mind. Introspection, according to Titchener, could yield only a description of mind, at least until about 1925. Titchener believed that a scientific psychology required more than mere description. Explanation was to be sought in physiology, which would explain why the sensory elements arise and become connected. Titchener rejected Wundt's attempts to psychologically explain the operation of the mind. According to Titchener's system, all that can be found in experience are sensory elements rather than processes such as attention. Appeal to such an unobservable entity as apperception was illegitimate in Titchener's eyes, a view that betrays his positivism. He therefore sought to explain mind by reference to observable nerve physiology. Titchener rejected as wholly unnecessary the term apperception, which in Wundt's psychology gave rise to attention. Attention itself Titchener reduced to sensation. One obvious attribute of any sensation is clarity, and Titchener said that attended sensations are simply the clearest ones. Attention was not for him a mental process, but simply an attribute of sensation, clearness, produced by certain nerve processes. What of the mental effort that Wundt says goes along with attention? This too Titchener reduced to sensations. Titchener wrote, "When I am trying to attend, I find myself frowning, wrinkling my forehead, etc. All such bodily sets and movements give rise to characteristic sensations. Why should not these sensations be what we call attention?" Titchener's psychology represented an attempt to turn a narrowly conceived version of British philosophical psychology into a complete science of the mind. It was never very popular or influential beyond his own circle, and is in many respects important only as a significant dead end in psychology, and for misleading English-speaking psychologists about Wundt's voluntaristic ideas. Structuralism died with Titchener and has seldom been mourned since. Interesting. All right, quick water break right here. And let me turn back on the computer. All right, just checking. All right. Let me just make sure we're still going. All right. What page are we on? 238. 238. We're picking up on where are we? Phenomenological alternatives on 237, and we're going all the way. We're almost there. We're on 237. We have about 254. What is that? 18 more pages to go, 17 more pages to go, something like that. Yeah, anyway, let's go. Phenomenological alternatives. As the movement to make psychology into a natural science along positivist lines gained momentum, important alternative conceptions of psychology arose outside the field. Two alternatives were especially important. One came from the historian Wilhelm Dilthey. His objection to natural science psychology grew out of the Vico-Herder distinction between the natural and human sciences that Wundt had accepted in his Leipzig system. The other came from Franz Brentano's act psychology, rooted in neo-Aristotelian perceptual realism. Both Dilthey and Brentano rejected the analytic atomism of psychologies, such as Titchener's, believing that it artificially imposed pre-theoretical assumptions into the reality of lived experience. They preferred instead to describe consciousness as it appears naively, without presuppositions about its nature, an undertaking called phenomenology. They also resisted the narrow specialization overtaking the natural sciences in general, including psychology, should it become one. Dilthey wrote that the rise of positivistic science was dangerous because it would lead to increasing skepticism, a cult of superficial, unfruitful fact-gathering, and thus the increasing separation of science from life. Franz Brentano's act psychology. Working within the Cartesian tradition, the way of ideas, most psychologists sought to analyze consciousness into its component pieces. Titchener's was simply the most extreme version of the practice. They took for granted the idea that just as the physical world is composed of objects that can be analyzed into atomic components, the objects of consciousness are made of mind stuff analyzable into component sensations and feelings. The analytic spirit that worked so brilliantly for physics and chemistry was simply imported into psychology with hopes for similar success. There were differences among Cartesian psychologists about the nature of psychological analysis and the forces that bound atomic units into the larger, meaningful objects of experience. Wundt, for example, regarded psychological analysis instrumentally as a heuristic device that allowed psychology to go forward as a science. The so-called atomic sensations were imaginary, not real, he said, providing a useful framework within which to pose questions for scientific investigation by introspection. In a somewhat Kantian way, Wundt believed the mind actively synthesized the elements of experience into the objects of consciousness. Once again, in a somewhat Kantian way, Wundt believed the mind actively synthesized the elements of experience into the objects of consciousness, assigning association a relatively minor role as the gravity of the mental universe. Associationists such as Titchener, on the other hand, believed in the reality of sensory elements and followed Hume in making association the sole source of mental organization. Notwithstanding these differences, however, the dominant approach to consciousness was to analyze it into its component parts. There was, however, a dissident tradition rooted in perceptual realism. If we are in more or less direct touch with the world, then there is no mind stuff to analyze into atomic constituents. Instead of analyzing experience, we should simply describe it as we find it. This approach to consciousness is called phenomenology. In America, the realist descriptive tradition was kept alive by the influence of Scottish common sense psychology, and would be promoted in psychology by William James, and in philosophy by the neo-realists. In the 20th century, realism inspired B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism, and in the 21st century, it inspired the movement of embodied cognition. In the German-speaking world, Franz Brentano, born 1838 and died in 1917, championed realism. Brentano was a Catholic theologian who broke with the Church when it proclaimed the doctrine of papal infallibility. He became a philosopher at the University of Vienna, where he supported the establishment of scientific psychology. He worked out an influential version of psychological realism that gave rise in philosophy to phenomenology and in psychology to the Gestalt movement. Unsurprisingly, for a Catholic philosopher, Brentano's concept of mind was rooted in the Aristotelian realism that had been preserved and developed by medieval scholastic philosophers, but had been abandoned during the scientific revolution. With the Scots, Brentano regarded the way of ideas as an artificial imposition of a false metaphysical theory on naive experience. Inaugurating philosophical phenomenology, he tried to describe experience as it is given naively in experience. Brentano found the mind to consist of mental acts directed at meaningful objects outside it. It was not a collection of complex mental objects made up of sensory atoms. Every mental phenomenon is characterized by what the scholastics of the Middle Ages called the intentional or mental inexistence of an object, and what we might call, though not without ambiguity, and direction toward an object. Every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself, although they do not all do so in the same way. In presentation, something is presented. In judgment, something is affirmed or denied. In love, loved. In hate, hated. In desire, desired, and so on. It's so interesting that as we're approaching, the 20th century, late into the 19th century, psychology is still basically philosophy. They're still debating on how do we know what's real? What are real? What are our ideas? What is the self? It seems like over the past 2,000 years, because for this book that we've been reading for 2,000 years. No, really, we started this like 2 months ago. But essentially, the debate is what is real, what is perception, what do we understand about the world? And as late as 1874, we were still debating about how do we know what is real. This is what I'm getting. Like, I went into this book, like, trying to understand the history of psychology, and I'm ending up more with analytical, philosophical stuff. This has been more of a philosophical read than it has been a psychological read, which is interesting. That's the number one thing I'm taking away from this book. A lot of philosophy and the debates within psychology about how it departs from psychology, physiology, the natural sciences, etc. Anyway, I'm going to continue here. Sorry for that diatribe. The contrast between Brentano's description of the mind and the Cartesian Lockean analysis of the mind is significant. The latter sees ideas as mental objects that represent physical objects external to us. Moreover, ideas represent objects only indirectly, because ideas are themselves composed of meaningless sensory elements, such as red sensation number 113, brown sensation number 14, brightness levels 3 through 26, or 3 C sharps followed by an A flat. This is why and how Descartes introduced a degree of paranoia to philosophy, bringing on the skeptical crisis of the Enlightenment. Because the world as we experience it, consciousness, is an assemblage out of sensory bits, we have no guarantee that ideas do, in fact, correspond to objects. Hence, genuine objective knowledge of the world becomes doubtful, the starting point of Cartesian philosophy. Brentano, on the other hand, saw an idea as a mental act by which one grasps objects themselves. As acts, ideas cannot be resolved into atomic units. The mind is orderly because the world is orderly, not because of the gravity of association, Hume, or because the mind itself imposes order on the world, Kant. The mind is not, for Brentano, a mental world only incidentally connected to the physical world, but the means by which an organism actively grasps the real world outside itself. In philosophy, Brentano's goal of describing consciousness rather than analyzing it into pieces became the phenomenological movement, beginning with his student Edmund Husserl, born 1859 and died in 1938. Phenomenology was further developed by Martin Heidegger, born 1888 and died in 1976, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, died in 1908 and was born in 1908 and died in 1961. And its influenced the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre, born in 1905 and died in 1980. Although these thinkers' influence has been relatively slight in the English-speaking world, they are major figures in the 20th century European philosophy. Brentano also taught psychologists, including Sigmund Freud and Christian von Ahrenfels. For academic psychology, Brentano's most important student was Karl Stumpf, born 1848 and died in 1946, who provided the link between Brentano and Gestalt psychology. When the leading German university, the University of Berlin, established a psychological institute in 1894, Stumpf became its first director. There he taught or trained the founders of Gestalt psychology, inspiring them to describe consciousness as it was, not as empiricist atomism said it must be. Continuing here, Wilhelm Dilthey and the Human Sciences. The historian Wilhelm Dilthey, born 1833 and died in 1911, linked intentionality to the distinction between the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften. As we learned in Chapter 1, explaining human actions is fundamentally different from explaining physical events. A woman shooting and killing a man is a physical event. However, understanding the event in human terms involves more than tracing the path of a bullet and showing how the bullet caused the man's death. We need to know why she shot the man, not just how she did so. Suppose the man is her husband and he was trying to quietly enter the house late at night because he has come home a day early from a trip out of town. She might have shot him because she thought he was a dangerous burglar, perhaps a rapist. Believing this, she acted, therefore, in self-defense. On the other hand, if their marriage was failing, she might have recognized him and shot him for insurance money, or out of revenge for a sexual affair, or both. In either case, the physical events remain the same, but the meaning of the act, and thus the proper response of police and prosecutors, depends on getting inside the woman's mind. Specifically, we need to know the intentional objects of her shooting. Did she aim at, the original Latin meaning of intention is to aim at, a burglar or at her husband? If the former, she is at most guilty of negligence. If the latter, she is guilty of murder. Natural science cannot resolve this issue, nor can a scientific physiological psychology, for the direction of mental acts lies not in neurons, but in the subjective mind. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Dilthey said, we explain nature. We understand psychic life. Natural scientists explain physical events to predict and control them in the future. The historian is concerned with unique human actions recorded in history and seeks to understand the reasons and motives that lie behind them. Similarly, Dilthey said, psychologists must seek to understand the motives and reasons that lie behind human actions in the here and now. The study of intentionality of motives and reasons means going beyond what natural science can responsibly offer. A psychology that remains limited to the study of conscious perception and physiology would truly separate itself from human life. The concept of intentionality and the status of reasons and motives remain controversial in psychology. The idea of making psychology into a purely physiological discipline is again being proposed, and its advocates want to replace intentional concepts in psychology with purely physiological ones. Cognitive science proposes that the human mind is a sort of computer program implemented in the brain, and seeks to explain human thoughts and action as the result of computational informational processing. Just as computers lack reasons and motives for what they do, although sometimes we treat them as if they didn't, perhaps human reasons and motives are convenient fictions too. Moving on, systematic introspection, the Wurzburg School, from 1901 to 1909. Okay. One of Wundt's most outstanding and successful students was Oswald Kolb, born 1862 and died in 1915. Pardon. Like most psychologists of his generation, Culp was influenced by positivism and strove to make psychology more a complete natural science and less a branch of philosophy, resting only partially in experimentation. Writing in a book aimed at philosophers, Culp spoke for his generational colleagues. If we define philosophy as the science of principles, we cannot call these psychological investigations philosophical. Indeed, there is general agreement on the point among experimental or physiological psychologists. Hence, it would seem well to dispense with the idea of a general philosophy of mind, or of the mental sciences altogether. Moreover, although he thought that historical inquiries into the mind, such as Wundt's Volcker psychology, might possibly become scientific, Culpe's definition of scientific psychology was not very different from his friend Titchener's. We may take it then that the field of psychology as a special science has now been definitely marked out. It includes A, the reduction of more complex facts of consciousness to more simple, B, the determination of the relations of dependency, which hold between physical processes and the physical neural processes which run parallel to them, C, the application of experiment to obtain an objective processes and an exact knowledge of their nature. When Culp left Leipzig for the University of Würzburg, he undertook the introspective study of thinking, championing the cause of psychology as a comprehensive natural science. In doing so, he sided with Wundt's positivistic Heidelberg system, rather than his more Kantian Leipzig system. Two important results emerged from Culp's research program. The first indicated that, contrary to the way of ideas, some contents of consciousness couldn't be traced to sensations or feelings. The second undermined associationism as an account of thinking, suggesting with Brentano that thoughts are acts, not passive representations. The method Culp developed to study thinking was called the Ausfragen method, the method of questions. It departed significantly from the practice of introspection at Leipzig. Wundt's experiments were quite simple, involving little more than reaction to, or a brief description of, a stimulus. Fechner's psychophysics, Donder's mental chronometry, and Wundt's apperception experiments are examples of this procedure. Under Culp, the tasks were made more difficult and the job of introspection was more elaborate. A question of some sort was asked of the observer, hence the name of the method. Sometimes the task was a simple one, such as giving an association to a stimulus word, and sometimes the task was quite difficult, such as agreeing or disagreeing with a lengthy passage from some philosopher. Remember that the observers and experiments in these days were not naive undergraduates, but philosophically trained professors and graduate students. The observer gave the answer in the normal way, but was supposed to attend to the mental processes that had been set in motion by the question, and that served. Sorry. The observer gave the answer in the normal way, but was supposed to attend to the mental processes that had been set in motion by the question and that solved the problem it posed. After giving the answer, the observer reported what had happened in his mind between the question and the answer. That is, he was to describe his thought processes. The method was deceptively simple and the results was intensely controversial. The first result were a shock to almost all psychologists. Thoughts can be imageless. That is, some of the contents of consciousness cannot be traced, as the way of ideas said, to sensations, feelings, or images of these. This finding emerged in the first Würzburg paper by A.M. Mayer and J. Orth, published in 1901. In this experiment, the observer was instructed to respond with the first word that came to mind after hearing a stimulus word. The experimenter gave a ready signal, called out the stimulus word, and started a stopwatch. The observer gave a response and the experimenter stopped the watch. The observer then described the thinking process. Meyer and Orth reported that most thinking involved definite images or feelings associated with acts of will. However, wrote Meyer and Orth, apart from these two classes of conscious processes, we must introduce a third group. The observers very frequently reported that they experienced certain conscious processes which they could describe neither as definite images nor as acts of will. For example, while serving as an observer, Meyer made the observation that following the stimulus word meter, there occurred a peculiar conscious process, not further definable, which was followed by the spoken word troshi. So orthodoxy was wrong, according to Meyer and Orth. Non-imaginal events in consciousness had already been found. What was to be made of imageless thought? The Wurzburgers' own interpretations changed during the life of the school. Meyer and Orth did no more than discover imageless thoughts, vague, impalpable, almost indescribable conscious states. Later on, they were identified simply as thoughts themselves. The final theory was that thought is actually an unconscious process, reducing the imageless thought elements to conscious indicators of thinking rather than thinking itself. However, on both sides of the Atlantic, many psychologists found the Wurzburg methods, results, and interpretations to be unacceptable or at least suspect. Writing in 1907, Wundt rebutted the Wurzburgers' conclusions by rejecting their method. He argued that the Wurzburg experiments were sham experiments, dangerous reversions to unreliable armchair introspection that happened to be conducted in a laboratory. According to Wundt, experimental control was entirely lacking in the thought experiments. The observer did not know exactly what task would be set. The ensuing mental process would vary from observer to observer and from trial to trial, so the results could not be replicated. Finally, said Wundt, it is difficult, if not impossible, for an observer to both think about the set problem and watch that process at the same time. Consequently, Wundt said, the so-called findings of imageless thought were invalid. Sharing Culp's expansive definition of the scope of introspection, Titchener replicated the Wurzburger studies in order to refute them and defend his associationist tradition. Methodologically, Titchener echoed Wundt by claiming that observers' reports of imageless thought were not descriptions of consciousness at all, but fabrications based on beliefs about how one would solve the problems set in the experiments. Experimentally, Titchener's students performed thought experiments and reported that they could find no evidence of imageless thought elements. They successfully traced all conscious content to sensations or feelings. For example, according to Titchener, many superficially plausible imageless thoughts could be traced by Cornell observers to kinesthetic feelings of the body that had eluded the Wurzburg observers. Titchener concluded that the Wurzburgers had failed to accurately observe their conscious experience. They found a mental content that proved difficult to analyze further, but instead of pursuing the analysis, they gave up and called the content imageless thought. Other commentators offered alternative interpretations of the Wurzburg results. Some suggested that certain types of minds possess imageless thoughts and others do not, reducing the Titchener-Culp controversy to one of individual differences. This hypothesis was criticized as unparsimonious. Why should nature create two types of mind to attain the same end, accurate thinking? And why should one type predominate at Wurzburg and the other at Cornell? The hypothesis of unconscious thinking was rejected on the grounds that what is not unconscious is not mental but physiological, and therefore not a part of psychology. As the controversy wore on, it became more and more intractable. In 1911, J.R. Engel wrote, "One feels that the differences which divide certain of the writers are largely those of mutual misunderstanding as to the precise phenomenon under discussion." Engel was disturbed that the combatants in the dispute had been largely reduced to mere assertion and denial. It is or isn't. I mean, thoughts can be imageless, I guess. Maybe. I don't know. I have to think about that a bit more. I'm still just soaking it all in. I'm soaking it all in right now. Anyway, Let me check comments real quick, see if there's anything in the comment section. We might take another 10-minute break when we reach page 240, just so you know. Just going to do a quick check here because we only have about, 10 more pages to go. Yeah, we're going to take a break on 245. On 245, we'll stop at the scientific phenomenology Gestalt psychology, and then we'll read the rest from 245 to 254 in one go. Yeah, all right. In America, the most important consequences of the debate about imageless thought was the suspicion that introspection was a fragile and unreliable tool, easily prejudiced by theoretical expectations. The Wurzburg observers believed in imageless thought, and they found it. Titchener's observers believed only in sensations and feelings, and they found only those. R.M. Ogden, an American supporter of imageless thought, wrote that if once in Titchener's criticisms of the Wurzburg methods were valid, may we not carry the point a step farther and deny the value of all introspection. Indeed, in a recent discussion among psychologists, this position was vigorously maintained by two among those present. Ogden himself suggested that the differing results from Titchener's laboratory at Cornell and Kultz and Wurzburg betrayed unconscious bias based on different training. The imageless thought controversy revealed difficulties with the introspection method, and by 1911, the year of Ogden's papers, we find some psychologists ready to discard it altogether. Ogden's two among those present were already behaviorists without the name. The imageless thought dispute tallied well with the debates over the nature of hypnosis and hysteria that were occurring in abnormal psychology at the same time. In both lines of investigation, it appeared that people, whether highly motivated researchers or clinical patients, could be so influenced by suggestions as to render introspective reports and behavior suspect as objective scientific evidence about the mind and behavior. If subjects, participants in later terminology, simply said and did what experimenters inadvertently hinted they should, it seemed that experiments were helpless to reveal human nature. Soon, in launching behaviorism as a truly objective psychology, John B. Watson would cite the imageless thought controversy as a signal failing of introspective psychology, failing to see that behavior as well as subjective experience and introspective reports could be influenced by experimenters' expectations. Basically, a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's how I'm interpreting that. The Wurzburgers' second finding led them to reject associationism as an adequate account of thinking. Their key question was this: what makes one idea rather than another follow a given idea? For free association, as in Mayer and Orth's experiment, associationism has a plausible answer. If the stimulus word is bird, the observer may respond canary. The associationist can then say that the bird-canary bond is the strongest in the observer's associative network. However, this situation is complicated if we use a method of constrained association, as Henry J. Watt did in 1905. In this method, we set a specific task for the observer to carry out, such as give a subordinate category or give a superordinate category. To the former task, the observer may still reply canary. To the latter task, the correct response cannot be canary, but instead should be animal. However, these tasks are no longer free associations, but rather acts of directed thinking that produce propositions that may be true or false, unlike free association. So the simple associative bond bird, canary, is overridden in directed thinking. The Wurzburgers argued that the force of association alone cannot explain the nature of rational thought, for something other than associative glue must direct thought along the proper lines in the associative network in order for an observer to respond correctly to such tasks as Watt's. The Wurzburgers proposed that the task itself directed thinking. In their later terminology, they said that the task establishes a mental set of a determining tendency in the mind that properly directs the observer's use of his or her associative network. These experiments suggested unconscious thinking, for observers found that given the task gives a superordinate category to canary, the response bird popped into their heads with little experienced mental activity. The Wurzburgers concluded that the mental set accomplishes thinking even before the problem is given. The observer is so prepared to give a superordinate category that the actual response occurs automatically. The concept of mental set reflects the influence of Brentano's act psychology, which the Wurzburgers absorbed from Husserl. Thoughts are not passive representations, mental objects, but mental acts inherently directed at other aspects of the mind or at the world. As Culp wrote, the fundamental characteristic of thinking is referring, meaning, aiming at something. Exactly Brentano's formulation of intentionality. As the studies of the Wurzburg psychologists developed, they moved toward a psychology of function, mental acts, in Brentano's terms, from the traditional analytic psychology of content. Initially, they had been concerned to describe a new mental content, imageless thought, but in the end, they found that thought as act eluded description in terms of sensory content. As Brentano held, mental activity, function, is more fundamental and psychologically real than supposed atoms of the mind. The future of psychology, especially in America, lay with the psychology of function rather than of content. The contents, the objects of the mind, proved to be ephemeral things, vastly more difficult to pin down than the substantial atoms constituting physical objects. As evolution began to affect psychology, asking how the mind acts to serve an organism's survival in the struggle for existence became a more important question than asking how many visual sensory elements there might be. As we will see in Chapter 10, the evolution of psychology from studying consciousness to studying mental function was gradual and almost unnoticed by working psychologists of the early 20th century. The imageless thought debate was an early harbinger of this transition. We can use Chalmers' distinction between two concepts of mind, the causal concept and the conscious concept, to show how and why introspection lost its central place in psychology as it turned functional, and how at the same time this demotion of introspection was barely noticed. In Chalmers' scheme, the causal concept of mind is about mental states, not processes that cause behavior. Thus, rummaging in my fridge is caused by believing that there's a soda inside. The conscious conception of mind equates mind and consciousness, as in Cartesianism. But while these two concepts overlap, they are not coextensive. Believing that there's a soda in my fridge is both causal and conscious because I'm aware of what I'm looking for. On the other hand, a mental state can be causal but not conscious. As I feed $1.50 into a vending machine while talking to a colleague about politics, I'm not likely to be consciously thinking there's a soda in the machine. Finally, a conscious experience can be epiphenomenal, accompanying behavior but not causing it. If I ask, what's the capital of France, you may experience a memory of visiting Paris, but it's unlikely that your conscious image caused you to say Paris. Instead, you have retrieved a memorized fact from semantic memory that by accident is linked in your personal case to your visit to Paris, an incident stored in your episodic or autobiographical memory. Chalmers says that because both concepts use the same word, mind, unnecessary controversies have been caused by equivocation, theorists thinking they are arguing about the nature of the mind when in fact they're talking about two different things. Both conceptions were present, without the difference being acknowledged, from the earliest days of psychology. Fechner's psychophysics investigated mind as consciousness, measuring how physical stimuli mapped onto sensations. On the other hand, Donder's mental chronometry measured the speed of non-conscious processes, such as judgment. Without anyone realizing, the imageless thought controversy was based on just this equivocation between mind as content, the Tichnerian view, and mind as function, the emergent Wurzburg or Darwinian view. Laboratories asked participants to report mental processes evoked by solving problems, but they reported different results. Wurzburg psychologists, led by Culp, began by asking a causal, that is, functional question about the mind. How does thinking work? But when Titchener entered the fray by contesting the existence of imageless thought, the question shifted to debating conscious content. Are there imageless thoughts or not? However, once we recognize the existence of epiphenomenal experience, the accuracy and reliability of introspection becomes besides the point. In contrasting Titchener's structural psychology with functional psychology, Angel wrote, "Functional psychology tries to discern and portray the typical operations of consciousness under actual life conditions, the causal concept, as over against the attempt to analyze and describe its elementary and complex contents, the conscious concept. An epiphenomenal experience such as remembering Paris might be reported thoroughly and with complete fidelity without revealing anything about the actual semantic memory search that produced the answer. From the perspective of finding the causes of behavior, what functionalists were interested in, the problem with introspection wasn't that it's subject to bias and suggestion, but that even if it weren't, it rarely revealed the springs of human thought or action." Historically, however, the systematic introspection of the Wurzburg school proved a dead end. As Wundt had intimated, the school's method was too subjective to yield replicable scientific results. Although Wurzburg-inspired work continued after 1909, the school essentially dissolved when Kolb left for the University of Bonn. No theory based on the Wurzburg studies was ever published, although there is evidence that Kolb was working on such a theory when he died. It is puzzling that from 1909 until his death, Kolb said almost nothing about the dramatic Wurzburg results. No alternative psychology arose from the Wurzburg school. Its methods were innovative, if findings stimulating, if anomalous, and in the concept of the mental set, it foreshadowed the functional psychology of the future. A more substantial offspring of Brentano's phenomenology was the Gestalt movement. On to studying memory. The controversy ensuing from attempts to study thinking via introspection revealed the difficulties inherent in transforming introspection from a philosopher's tool into an objective scientific method, providing an argument for redefining psychology as the study of public behavior. A different higher mental process, memory, proved more amenable to scientific investigation because it could be studied quantitatively and without introspection. Unlike the study of thoughts, which faded from the psychological scene for decades, the study of memory, or learning, flourished during the reign of behaviorism and continued into the era of cognitive science. The study of memory was initiated by Hermann Ebbinghaus, born 1850 and died in 1909. A young doctor of philosophy unattached to any university when he came across a copy of Fechner's Elements of Psychophysics in a second-hand bookstore. He admired the scientific precision of Fechner's work on perception and resolved to tackle the higher mental processes that Wundt had excluded from experimental treatment. Using himself as his only subject, Ebbinghaus set out in 1879 to demonstrate that some higher useful process could be experimentally investigated, a point Wundt, 1907, later conceded. The result was his Über das Gedächtnis, or memory, of 1885, which was hailed even by Wundt as a first-rate contribution to psychology and which helped win Ebbinghaus a professorship at the prestigious University of Berlin. Memory represented a necessarily small-scale but well-thought-out research program. Ebbinghaus decided to investigate the formation of associations by learning serial lists of nonsense syllables, meaninglessness, combinations of three letters he invented for the purpose. In electing to memorize nonsense syllables, Ebbinghaus revealed the functionalist cast of his thought. He chose nonsense syllables because they are meaningless, because the sameness of their content would not differentially affect the process of learning. He wanted to isolate and study memory as the pure function of learning, abstracting away any effects of content. The study of memory was further developed by George Elias Müller, born 1880 and died in 1943. The most rigorous experimentalist of the founding German psychologists. Mueller insisted on objectivity almost to the point of fanaticism and made a sort of factory out of his laboratory in Göttingen. Fittingly, he invented the memory drum, a machine for presenting Ebbinghaus's nonsense syllables as an objectively controllable pace. Theoretically, he insisted on association as the only mental force, rejecting the Wurzburger's notion of determining tendencies. As members of the younger generation of German academics, Ebbinghaus and Mueller were less Mandarin than Wundt, never trying to develop the overarching syntheses of psychological knowledge aimed at by Wundt and other German professors. In this respect, they were more like the American psychologists, whose emphasis on method and minimization of theory would come to dominate 20th century psychology, and Americans quickly took up their methods. In 1896, Mary Calkins augmented Ebbinghaus's serial learning method with a paired associate procedure in which the subject learns specific pairs of words or nonsense syllables. All right, so we're going to pick up here, scientific phenomenology, the Gestalt psychology. This is where we're going to pick up after we take a, let's say, 15-minute break. 15-minute break, rest our eyes, relax a bit, and then come up and finish. Yeah, I don't know why my tablet is speaking to me. I did not even touch it. I think somebody's listening. But anyway, we're going to pick up scientific phenomenology, Gestalt psychology. And yeah, we'll read that section and then the practical turn applied psychology. And that goes all the way to chapter 9. And we have how many more chapters in this book? We have... we have chapter 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. We have 7 more chapters to go. 7 more chapters to go in this very dense book. It's a textbook. This is the first textbook I think we've read on this channel. So, hey, I'm not surprised it's taking this long. But we will get it done. Everything just takes time. You know, everything takes time. But anyway, we're going to be taking a short break, 10 minutes. Then we'll pick up scientific phenomenology, Gestalt psychology. All right, welcome back to part 3 of episode 18 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity. This will be the final part of our reading for today as we complete all of chapter 8. And I hope you had a good break. Or if you are watching this on the playback when we snip this up, hopefully you're excited to finish off this chapter as we jump into scientific phenomenology, Gestalt psychology. And these are the final stretches. It's about 9 pages or so that we're going to read, and then we're going to call it a day. Okay? Without further ado, let's get into it. Scientific phenomenology, Gestalt psychology. Okay. The leading Gestalt psychologists were Max Wertheimer, born 1880 and died in 1943, Wolfgang Kohler, 1887 to 1967, and Kurt Kafka, 1887 to 1941. Wertheimer was the founder and inspirational leader of the movement and received his PhD from Kulp at Wurzburg. Kohler succeeded Stump as head of the prestigious Berlin Psychological Institute and was the primary theorist and researcher of the group, having been trained in physics as well as philosophy and psychology. Kafka was the first to write up Wertheimer's ideas and spread the message of Gestalt psychology worldwide through books and articles. Of their many students and associates, the most important was Kurt Lewin, 1890 to 1947. Lewin devised practical applications of Gestalt theories, inspired by Stumpf to describe rather than artificially analyze consciousness. They created a radically new approach to understanding conscious experience that rejected virtually every aspect of the Cartesian way of ideas. Even before the work of the Wurzburg school, it was becoming clear that the empiricist associative theory faced formidable difficulties in explaining how meaningful, organized objects of perception are allegedly created out of meaningless sensory atoms. Christian von Ehrenfeld born 1859 and died in 1932, with whom Wertheimer studied, had begun to formulate a rival viewpoint, introducing the term Gestalt, form, or whole, to psychology. A melody, Ehrenfels said, is more than a sequence of notes. A melody can be transposed into a different key, such that none of the notes, the sensory elements of which the melody is supposedly composed, remains the same, without altering our perception of it. Ehrenfels proposed that in addition to sensory elements, there were form elements, Gestaltqualitäten, composing the objects of consciousness. When Ehrenfels advanced this hypothesis in 1890, he left the ontological status of Gestalt qualities ambiguous. Were they imposed on sensory atoms by the mind, as Ehrenfels' own teacher, Alexius Meinong, born 1853 and died in 1920, proposed? Or were they something more objective structures, not elements, that existed in the world and were picked up by consciousness, as philosophical realists and phenomenologists thought? Gestalt psychology forcefully pursued the latter possibility. Gestalt psychologists' rejection of the Cartesian framework. Gestalt psychologists were horrified by atomistic theories of consciousness and offered Gestalt psychology as a liberating revolution against psychology's ancient regime. As Kohler said in his presidential address to the APA, "We were excited by what we found, and even more by the prospect of finding further revealing facts. Moreover, it was not only the stimulating newness of our enterprise which inspired us. There was also a great wave of relief, as though we were escaping from a prison. The prison was psychology as taught at the universities when we still were students. At the time, we had been shocked by the thesis that all psychological facts, not only those in perception, consist of unrelated inert atoms, and that almost the only factors which combine these atoms and thus introduce action are associations formed under the influence of mere contiguity. What had disturbed us was the utter senselessness of this picture, and the implication that human life, apparently so colorful and so intensely dynamic, is actually a frightful bore. That was not true of our new picture, and we felt that further discoveries were bound to destroy what was left of the old picture." Gestalt theorists held that the old picture, the way of ideas, rested on two flawed and unexamined assumptions. The first was the bundle hypothesis, essentially associative atomism, identified by Wertheimer, which held that, like chemical compounds, the objects of consciousness were made up of fixed and unchanging atomic elements. According to Wertheimer, the bundle hypothesis was a theoretical presupposition artificially imposed on experience, not a natural description of consciousness as we find it. Wertheimer wrote, "I stand at the window and see a house, trees, sky. Theoretically, I might say there were 327 brightnesses and nuances of color. Do I have 327? No, I have sky, house, and trees. It is impossible to achieve 327 as such. And yet, even though such droll calculation was possible and implied, say for the house 120, the tree 90, the sky 117, I should at least have this arrangement and division of the total, and not say 126, 127 and 100 and 100, or 150 and 177. The second flawed presupposition imposed on experience by the old picture was the constancy hypothesis, identified by Kohler. The constancy hypothesis was the physiological side of the way of ideas. It held that every sensory element in consciousness corresponded to a specific physical stimulus registered by a sense organ. In their critique of the bundle hypothesis and the constancy hypothesis, the Gestalt psychologists rejected almost the entire modern philosophy of mind. Atomism about consciousness began when Descartes served the world of experience, or ideas, from the world of physical objects. Perception became a matter of point-for-point projection of physical stimuli onto the screen of consciousness, as in a camera obscura. Only the minority tradition of philosophical realism was carried on by Gestalt psychology. The Gestalt Research Program. As a research program, Gestalt psychology began in 1910 with investigations into apparent motion led by Wertheimer, aided by Kohler and Kafka. Apparent motion is familiar through movies and video games, which are a series of rapidly presented still pictures that are experienced as objects in continuous smooth motion. In Wertheimer's experiments, observers viewed successive stroboscopic presentations of two vertical black bars in two different fixed locations on a white background. Wertheimer varied the interval between the offset of the presentation of the fixed stimulus and the onset of the presentation of the second stimulus. When the interval between presentations of the bars was 30 milliseconds, the observers saw two bars appearing simultaneously. When the interval was 60 milliseconds, the observer reported seeing a single bar moving from point to point. To give this experience a name free from the sort of theoretical presuppositions he was trying to avoid, Wertheimer dubbed it the pi phenomenon. I'm going to say phi phenomenon. The term apparent motion reflected the reigning interpretation when Wertheimer did his experiments. In the gap in the bundle and constancy hypothesis, psychologists explained apparent motion as an illusion, a cognitive error, in which the observer sees two identical objects in two places and then falsely infers that a single object moved from the first to the second point. Such an explanation holds that there is no experience of motion given in consciousness. The motion is merely apparent, and the experience is explained away. Wertheimer and his followers insisted, on the contrary, that the experience of motion was real, genuinely given in consciousness, although it did not correspond to any physical stimulus, contrary to the bundle and constancy hypotheses. So here's the Kanizsa triangle. Okay. The Gestalt idea can be illustrated by the perception of illusory contours in figure 8.4. One clearly perceives a triangle that is not, strictly speaking, there. Moreover, observers typically see the area enclosed by the phantom triangle as being lighter in brightness than the space outside. They thus experience a contour, a difference of light and dark, to which there is no corresponding physical stimulus. Illusory contours also show how Gestalt study of the phi phenomenon could be brought to bear on the problem of object perception. In figure 8.4, as in the perception of melodic form and in the phi phenomenon, we perceive a form, a Gestalt, to which no local physical stimulation corresponds. Objects, Wertheimer's house, trees, and sky, are immediately given in consciousness as meaningful wholes, not as collections of atomic sensations. When we are presented with a number of stimulus or stimuli, we do not, as a rule, experience a number of individual things, this one and that. Wertheimer wrote, instead, larger wholes separated from and related to one another are given in experience. Do such arrangements and divisions follow definite principles? Wertheimer said they did, and laid down a set of organizing principles, still cited in textbooks today. For example, following the law of similarity, we tend to see alternating columns of squares and circles rather than 5 rows of alternating squares and circles. Later, Kohler formulated an overarching organizing law, the law of prognons, the tendency of experiences to assume the simplest shapes possible. It is important to understand that according to Gestalt psychology, Gestalts are not imposed on experience by the mind, but are discovered in experience. Gestalts are objective, not subjective, especially as formulated by Kohler. Gestalts were physically real, natural self-organizations in nature, in the brain, and in experience, all of them isomorphic to one another. In physics, we find that dynamic forces spontaneously organize material particles into simple, elegant forms. The brain, Kohler said, is likewise a dynamic field of self-organizing force fields, reflecting the physical gestalts and giving rise to the gestalts of experienced objects. In a sense, Gestalt psychology has since become a kind of application of field physics to essential parts of psychology and brain physiology. Looking up here, Gestalt law of similarity, showing patterns of dots and squares. And going on, the old woman and the young girl, example of a Gestalt switch in perception. I guess, okay. Is that an old lady or a young lady? Or a young... I'm not going to do it. Don't do it. Anyway, the conflict between atomism and Gestalt self-organization extended to the study of behavior, including animal behavior. The leading student of animal behavior at the turn of the century was Edward Lee Thorndike, born 1874 and died in 1949, who turned the atomistic theory of consciousness inside out into an atomistic theory of behavior. He studied cats learning to work a manipulandum in order to escape from a puzzle box. From watching their apparently trial and error behavior, Thorndike concluded that animals do not form associations between ideas, but between the stimuli in the box and the response needed to escape it. A little later, Kohler studied the intelligence of apes and drew different conclusions. His apes showed insight as problems suddenly resolved themselves into simple solutions, just as gestalts emerged spontaneously in consciousness. According to Kohler, because the construction of the puzzle boxes hid their workings from the animal, it was reduced to trial and error by its situation, not because it was limited to forming stimulus-response associations. The atomistic picture of consciousness imposed its presuppositions on psychologists' understanding of perception. Thorndike's method imposed random atomistic stimulus-response learning on his animal subjects, which would have been capable of problem-solving if given the chance. Kohler sought a phenomenology of behavior no less than a phenomenology of consciousness. Later, Wertheimer applied the Gestalt concept of insight as self-organization of behavior to human thinking, and Kurt Lewin applied the Gestalt concept of the dynamic field to social behavior. We see that the Gestalt psychologists shared their generation's desire that psychology be a complete natural science. However, in their emphasis on non-reducible wholes, they did not share the positivist motivation that led other German psychologists, such as Kulp and Titchener, to pursue the same goal of psychology as a natural science. In the late 19th century, cultivated Germans feared atomistic conceptions of the universe. As we have seen, for them, atomism was linked to the twin evils of the machine, an object made of separable parts, and chaos, a formless void of atoms into which machines might dissolve. Believing in real wholes, Gestalts offered a third way in which order and meaning were inherent in nature. However, the term Gestalt was linked to conservative and racist strains of German thought that tended to reject modern science. For example, Houston Stewart Chamberlain said that life is Gestalt, and that with the exception of the atomized, nationless Jews, each race was a Gestalt, the highest race Gestalt being the Teutonic. Though not anti-Semitic, Ehrenfels voiced similar opinions, setting Gestalt good against chaos, evil, and finding hope of salvation in German music. It was therefore a bold move when Wertheimer, a Jew, appropriated the term Gestalt for a scientific, democratic, urban movement. Rather than blaming science for the modern predicament, he hoped to use good, tough-minded science to demonstrate that the world of experience was not a lie, but corresponded to a structured, organized, meaningful, physical reality. Going to the comments right here. We don't have no comments. All right, we have to work on these copyright issues. We have to work on these copyright issues on these videos, man. Y'all are making me do these live reaction videos, and they're getting copyright strikes. We have to work on that. We have to continue to dispute those, man. This is why I like doing original content, because copyright law is just so annoying. So annoying and unfair, honestly, even when it's blatantly fair use. Anyway, I'm going to continue here. We only have about 4 more pages to go, and then we're done with Chapter 8. Reception and influence of Gestalt psychology. By the mid-1930s, Gestalt psychology was well known around the world, a fact that briefly shielded Kohler from Nazi persecution. Nevertheless, there were significant German criticisms of Gestalt theory. The most important came from the school of Ganzheit, roughly holistic psychology, led by Felix Kruger, born 1874 and died in 1948. Wundt's successor at Leipzig, followers of Ganzheit found Gestalt psychology's theory that gestalts are physically objective to be insufficiently psychological. Their motto was "no gestalts without a gestalter," adhering to the Kantian view that gestalts are imposed by the mind rather than discovered. Beginning with Kafka in 1927, the leading Gestalt psychologist left Germany for the United States. Wertheimer was one of the first Jews stripped of his professorship by the Nazis. Kohler resisted the Nazi takeover of the universities, but despite support from the foreign ministry, also departed for America. There, the Gestalt psychologists confronted behaviorism in a society for which the concept of Gestalt had no cultural resonance. Although American psychologists respected the experimental findings of Gestalt psychology and even elected Kohler president of the APA, they found Gestalt theory strange and bewildering. In addition, the Gestalt theorists tended not to shed their German ways and found few opportunities to train graduate students. The exception was Kurt Lewin, who remade his personality on American lines, made sure he could train PhDs, and took up American topics such as group dynamics. The legacy of Gestalt psychology in psychology is hard to measure. Its demonstrations and principles of organization are still found in psychology textbooks. Its greatest contribution lay in reformulating the study of perception to carve nature at the joints. Gestalt theorists objected not to analyzing experience into parts, but to analyzing it into arbitrary parts. Perhaps because of Gestalt influence, psychologists remain wary of imposing pre-theoretical assumptions on their data, and Kohler's view of the brain as a self-organizing system is returning, unacknowledged in connectionist psychology and neuroscience. Nevertheless, Gestalt concern with wholeness and unity seems a faint voice from the now lost culture of the Bildungsbürger. Perhaps the best summary of Gestalt psychology's impact is offered by one of the last surviving Gestalt psychologists, A.S. Lutyens. Lutyens acknowledged that Gestalt terminology is often used in contemporary, especially American psychology, but he denied that the concepts to which the term refer have been assimilated. With its emphasis on wholes, on synthesis, and on placing psychology within a larger total comprehension of human existence, Gestalt psychology, like Wundt's, may have been too Mandarin for export. I mean, hey man, different strokes for different folks. Not everything translates across cultures, especially to the stupid American. The stupid American cannot imbibe everything. The practical turn, applied psychology. By and large, academic German psychologists resisted the idea that psychology should become an applied discipline. Wundt and his generation of psychologists saw psychology as part of philosophy, but most of the next generation of psychologists wanted to make it into a pure natural science. Academic psychologists resisted making psychology a practical field for three reasons. First was the great value Mandarin Germans placed on pure scholarship undertaken for its own sake. Practical enterprises were undertaken to make money, not to cultivate the soul, and the latter was the goal of Mandarin scholarship. Stumpf, for example, feared making psychology a narrow specialization bereft of Bildung. In particular, he loathed a certain sort of American whose whole aim is to get a PhD in the shortest possible time with the most mechanical work possible. Second, German academics had achieved Lehrfreiheit, a academic freedom to study and teach whatever one wanted. As a political bargain with Bismarck's German Reich, academics could do whatever they wished within the confines of the academy, but they were not to interfere in social and political matters. Third, even when German psychology turned in a functional direction, being concerned with mental processes rather than mental content, a transition we witnessed in the case of the Wurzburg School, its functionalism was not tied, as American functionalism would be, to Darwinian evolution. German concerns remained philosophical, whereas Americans looked on the mind as a practical organ of adaptation to the environment. Americans thus came to focus on how the mind operates in everyday life, and hence how to aid or improve its functioning, while German psychologists focused on the traditional epistemological question of how the mind knows the world. Nevertheless, social forces were at work within Germany and elsewhere that promoted the growth of psychology as an applied field of study. In France, we have noted psychology was connected with psychiatric clinics and therefore with the practical matter of understanding and curing psychopathology. And Binet studied infants and children with a view toward improving their education. Similarly, in Germany, William Stern, born 1871 and died in 1938, devised the influential concept of the intelligence quotient, or IQ. American psychology was applied almost from the outset, as we shall see in future chapters. Even in Germany, demand for practical science, including the natural sciences, was on the rise. For example, the German chemical industry was instrumental in establishing chemistry as a science in the German universities. Addressing the 1912 meeting of the Society for Experimental Psychology, the mayor of Berlin virtually demanded that psychology produce practical applications, implying that future government support for the new field depended on it. Commercial universities sprang up alongside state-sponsored universities. Wertheimer began his research on the five phenomenon at the Frankfurt Commercial Academy. Despite the resistance of the Mandarin elite, applied psychology, or psychotechnics as it was known in Germany, evolved alongside scientific psychology, including such fields as sports psychology, traffic psychology, and railroad psychology. The fate of the psychology of consciousness. What happened to the psychology of consciousness? Psychology is no longer defined as the science of consciousness, but as the science of behavior. It may therefore appear that the psychology of consciousness died sometime in the 20th century. From a theoretical perspective, that this is largely true. The psychological theories of Wundt, Titchener, and Culp are no longer taught. A little bit of the Gestalt tradition lives, albeit in attenuated forms. On the other hand, if we define the psychology of consciousness as a field of study within psychology, the psychology of sensation and perception, rather than as the universal definition of psychology, then the psychology of consciousness is alive and well. Since the early 1900s, numerous books have been published on the nature of consciousness, and in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, great strides have been made in explaining how humans experience the world. Our discipline today includes so much more than the study of sensation and perception that it has been lost in the plethora of subject areas that constitute contemporary psychology. The subsequent story of early psychology as an institution is a story of two nations. Slow growth in Germany. In Germany, the growth of psychology was greatly inhibited by the Mandarin culture of philosophical Bildung. As long as psychology remained where Wundt left it, in philosophy, psychologists had to compete with philosophers for professorships and resources. Especially as psychology became more completely experimental, it seemed to philosophers to be a rude intrusion on their traditional concerns, and they banded together to oppose its growth within philosophy. Even Brentano's student, Edmund Husserl, though sympathetic to Stumpf and Gestalt psychology, condemned positivistically inclined psychologists as experimental fanatics, worshipping the cult of the facts. Other philosophers agreed with younger psychologists that they should be grouped with chemists and physicists, not philosophers. However, efforts to move it elsewhere, for example to medicine, to join physiology, as Culp proposed, were unsuccessful. The coming to power of the Nazis in 1933 complicated matters. They destroyed the old Mandarin system and drove from Germany its best minds. Jews and others sickened by Nazi oppression left Germany in a remarkable emigration that included outstanding intellectuals of every type, from writers such as Thomas Mann to filmmakers such as Fritz Lang to physicists such as Albert Einstein. Important psychologists were among the numbered, most notably the Gestalt psychologists, who moved to the United States, and Sigmund Freud, who spent his last months in England. Appallingly, many psychologists who remained in Germany turned their rapidity in the Nazi direction, in some cases providing scientific justification for Nazi racial policies, often invoking the concept of Gestalt. In 1935, Felix Kruger endorsed the authoritarian policies of the Nazi state. The state's defense and jurisdiction cannot function without harshness. Imperiously, it demands that sacrifices of one's own will and even one's own life, in its capacity as a whole, that must continue to exist over all else. The people must make a sacrifice of their imperfection by obeying their state and freely recognizing the ordered power above them. Friedrich Sander, former student of the Wundt and follower of Kruger, linked psychology to the ideology of Nazism. In a 1937 public lecture, Sander said, "He who, with believing heart and thoughtful sense, intuits the driving idea of National Socialism back to its source, will everywhere rediscover two basic motives standing behind the German movement's colossal struggles: the longing for wholeness and the will towards Gestalt." Wholeness and Gestalt, the ruling ideas of the German movement, have become central concepts of German psychology. Present-day German psychology and the National Socialist worldview are both oriented toward the same goal: the vanquishing of atomistic and mechanistic forms of thought. In this way, though, scientific psychology is on the brink of simultaneously becoming a useful tool for actualizing the aims of National Socialism. Sander enthusiastically endorsed the extermination of the Jews, to many Germans the very image of rootless, atomistic chaos. Whoever would lead the German Volk back to its own Gestalt, whoever wants to help the Volk soul achieve the goal it longs for, to purely express its own being, this individual must eliminate everything alienated from Gestalt. Above all, he must nullify the power of all destructive foreign racial influences. The elimination of a parasitically proliferating Jewry has its deep ethical justification in this will of the German essence to pure Gestalt, no less than does the sterilization within their own Volk of carriers of inferior genetic material. Woo! Psychology won its autonomy under the Nazi regime. The founding generation of psychologists had resisted making psychology into mere psychotechnics. Nevertheless, in 1941, German psychotechnic psychology won bureaucratic recognition as an independent field of study. Because the Wehrmacht required training psychologists to assist in the selection of officers. This proved a Faustian bargain, of course, when the Nazi regime brought upon Germany the destruction of World War II and the subsequent division of Germany into East and West. Not until the 1950s did psychology in Germany get on its feet again, and then it was an entirely new environment, dominated by American ideas. Transplantation to America, final section. In one respect, German psychology flourished in America. As we shall see in chapters 10 through 14, the growth of psychology in America quickly outpaced growth in Germany or any other country. For example, the APA was founded a decade before the German Society for Experimental Psychology. In other respects, however, the psychology of consciousness in its German form could not be carried beyond the borders of Mandarin Germany. G. Stanley Hall wrote in 1912, "We need a psychology that is usable, that is dietetic, efficient for thinking, living, and working. And although Wundtian thoughts are now so successfully cultivated in academic gardens, they could never be acclimated here, as they are antipathetic to the American spirit and temper. The future of psychology lay largely in America, but it would be a psychology much changed from its German roots." All right. Oh, here's the definition of hedgehogs. I asked earlier, what the fuck is a hedgehog? Here he goes. In Berlin, in 1957, Berlin proposes that intellectuals tend to fall into one or two types: hedgehogs and foxes. Hedgehogs are system builders like Plato or Descartes, whose thought is guided by some all-encompassing vision. Foxes think cleverly about many things but have no single vision. Socrates was a fox. and Plato was a hedgehog. Okay. System builders versus just wily thinkers. Okay, I get it. All right. That's the end of chapter 8. We finished an entire chapter. That's the first time we did this for this book. And we're going to be reading chapter 9 tomorrow. We're going to be finishing chapter 9. The psychology of the unconscious. Chapter 9, how many pages is that? Let's take a look here. Psychology of the unconscious. It starts on page 254 and goes all the way to page 281. So about, what is that? 26 pages or so, 27 pages. Yeah, that's doable. We can knock that out tomorrow. So we'll do chapter 9 tomorrow, and hopefully you found this enlightening, engaging. Hopefully the breaks weren't too disruptive for anybody that was listening in the playback immediately after this. And I will catch y'all tomorrow. Y'all be easy out there. Peace.